1 minute.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition and another week of the most disruptive show covering news and events across our divided states, as well as across the surface of our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. Hope everybody had a good weekend and everybody is having a good morning. Let's get into the news. In COVID news, first up, at least 1,299 new coronavirus deaths yesterday and 87,727 new cases reported. Over the past week, there has been an average of 117,993 cases per day. That is a decrease of 31% from the average 2 weeks earlier. I'm just going to say it, Jamarl. Let's hope I'm not jinxing it by saying it. For the last couple of weeks, the numbers continue to be decreasing. The last couple of weeks, the numbers of new infections, at least, if you remember, 2 weeks ago, for the whole week, it was like 32, 33% down from 2 weeks before. This last week, it was anywhere between like 32 and 29% down from the 2 weeks before. And that trend continues today, where it is 31% down from 2 weeks earlier, which itself, of course, was down from 2 weeks earlier before that. So good stuff there. I don't know how else to say it, but that's better than the alternative, which is either it stays steady or it increases. As of Monday morning, more than 27 million people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 463,000 people have died from it. South Africa has temporarily canceled its rollout of the AstraZeneca vaccine. This is due to a study released on Sunday, which showed the vaccine provided only minimal protection against a local variant of the coronavirus circulating in the country. A spokesperson for AstraZeneca said the company was working closely with the South African Ministry of Health and said it still believes the vaccine will provide protection against the worst effects of the new B.1.351 variant. China's National Health Commission announced today that for the first time in about 2 months, its mainland recorded no new locally transmitted COVID-19 cases. The country recorded a total of 14 new cases on Sunday, but it was determined to be infections brought back from overseas. The report also said that Beijing does not count asymptomatic cases. More than 1,500 more elderly residents of New York State adult care facilities died from COVID-19 than health officials previously reported, a new report reveals. So it's even worse, Jamarl. I feel a bit bad about chuckling about that, but this is after just a couple of weeks ago, Andrew Cuomo came under a little bit of fire, not enough fire, but a little bit of fire nationwide for having presided over an administration that hid a significant chunk of COVID deaths in nursing home. And again, now more than 1,500 more residents of New York State's adult care facilities died from COVID-19 than had been previously reported. The number accounting for an eightfold leap over the 219 deaths reported earlier from the facilities comes after state officials adjusted the figures to reflect adult care patients who died in hospitals rather than the centers themselves. The revelation also comes one day after state health officials also quietly updated their statistics for nursing home deaths, from the pandemic to reflect an additional 4,067 patients who died in hospitals. This is, I'll be honest, I need to look into this more. This isn't making as much sense to me as I want it to, but what's your take,
the number
Jamarl? What do you
of
think?
hospitalizations going on for oh wait, you're talking about the school system? I didn't hear the first part of the last thing that you said. Said it one more time.
It's okay. Let's talk about it more later. More than 1,500 more elderly residents of New York State's adult care facilities died from COVID-19 than health officials previously reported. And that is, after the other previous revelations about how more than 4,000 more deaths occurred in nursing care homes due to sort of miscounts based on how people were sent to the hospital and died in the hospital, even though they contracted the sickness.
He didn't get enough
nursing
pushback
homes.
on that. He didn't get anywhere near enough pushback on that. I mean, if you think of, because basically Cuomo put through policies that got a lot of these people injured and, let's be honest, dead. And for them to treat him as if it was a success, that's, I understand they wanted to push back against Trump, so they had their version of him doing his briefings and everything else. But this is not a success. I'm sorry, it's not. It's just not. So yeah, these numbers are even worse.
No, it's not nearly. No. New York was as far as I can tell, even though they're doing a bit better now, was the state that dealt worst with the pandemic. Now, admittedly, that's because New York City is it is our most concentrated urban hub, and it's part of the whole wider, Eastern Seaboard metroplex there. But still, they could have handled it better. So, I mean, they suffered. They were the first massive epicenter in the U.S. And then we've had conversations with numerous guests who told us about how the economy has gone into a slump since then. Now, admittedly, we've talked about how we're in the worst of both worlds, with both the economic toll that various parts of our country have taken after the lockdown, as well as the death toll, which continues to rise. Although, thankfully, again, the infection rate is dropping. Nationally, in political news, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot and the CEO of Chicago Public Schools have announced a quote-unquote tentative agreement with the Chicago Teachers Union. Under that plan, which has not yet been formally approved by the union, pre-K students would head back to school on Thursday, February 11th. Kindergarten through 5th grade teachers and students would return March 1st, and 5th through 8th grade teachers and students would be back March 8th. It is currently unclear when the union will vote on the issue. We were talking about this with our guest, Bill Ayers, on Friday, just shortly, who is lamenting the state of Chicago's public schools and talking about Lori Lightfoot's handling of this, likening her in some ways to her predecessor, Rahm Emanuel, Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel. We'll see if this deal goes through. In Houston, Texas, leaders unveiled a 2-block mural Saturday dedicated to George Floyd and located directly in front of his alma mater, Jack Yates High School. And on the national level, the Biden administration will move today to rejoin the United Nations Human Rights Council nearly 3 years after President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from it. In international news, in an interview on CBS yesterday, President Biden said the U.S. does not need to engage China as a direct adversary. He complimented Xi Jinping on some personal qualities while criticizing him on his politics. Andre, let's play this short clip from that interview.
He's very bright. He's very tough. He doesn't have, and I don't mean as a criticism, just a reality, he doesn't have a democratic small d bone in his body. But he is, the question is, I've said to him all along that we need not have a conflict, but there's going to be an extreme conflict.
But there's going to be an extreme competition. That's how that ends. There's going to be extreme competition. And, well, yeah, I mean, that is publicly known. Anyway, his voice is a little bit of a soporific. It kind of tends to put me to sleep in the morning. I'll be honest.
Biden's voice puts you to sleep in the morning.
Anyway, President, a little bit. Compare that to Trump for a second. Seriously, compare his tone to Trump's tone. Trump is like almost constantly on the attack and on the verge of yelling, and Biden is almost on the verge of whispering. So they're all the way across the spectrum from each other.
He said he doesn't have a small D bone in his body. But at the very least, he's open to have, I guess, some kind of interaction. this was something that was going on earlier where the question was going to be, what is Biden going to do towards China? And I remember, I can't think of the guy's name. It was a lecture that Glenn Greenwald put up. But basically, he made the point that says the connection between Donald Trump and China was dramatically different than one between Biden and China. That because of his connections to Wall Street and those type of things, that Biden will be more conciliatory on this very specific front, as opposed to having this kind of, scorched earth foreign policy that ends up hurting your own country more than it hurts the other country. So that's an interesting dynamic. Also, it doesn't matter if he has a small D bone in his body. It doesn't matter in the least. We have all sorts of countries we work with that don't have a small D bone in their body. Saudi Arabia, you can make an argument about Turkey at some point. Not to mention some of the Middle Eastern countries. I guess I'm making the point that we don't typically care about the small D stuff. We typically care about how they interact with us. And look, it's better than the boisterousness that we were getting out of Donald Trump. So it's small, but I'll take it.
Okay. This is not. I'm not pushing back on you, but I just want to point out hypocrisy for just a second. We don't care. We don't care about the small d democratic nature of foreign elected leaders unless we want to overthrow their country. In which case, we tend to use that as our first pretext. That's our first line of offense against other countries. Is they are A, undemocratic, and or B, guilty of human rights abuses. And those are basically our two lines of offense. Now, the second one, there are arguments that people certainly make there. I don't think it's our right to invade other countries just because we don't like how they're treating people. We should take a better look at how we're treating our own people. But with the first one, doesn't it seem hypocritical that we're willing to court some leaders and be like, well, okay, they're not Democrats, but that's okay. We can work with them. We'll just extremely compete with them. Whereas with others, it seems useful as a pretext for invading them. How do we? There's cognitive dissonance here.
No, that's not cognitive dissonance.
You see what I'm saying?
It's the way governments act. Or it's the way states act. I know what you're trying to say. You're saying this is not going with a certain level of integrity, et cetera, et cetera. But like I told you, I don't believe politics is that way anyway. I think it's you get away with what you can get away with. And you can use a selective argument to attack one and ignore it on the other hand. They do it all the time. Tillerson memo, May 17th, basically telling Tillerson, friends, right here, the United States should use human rights as a club against adversaries like Iran, China, North Korea, while giving a pass to repressive allies like Philippines, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Otherwise, you're going to end up with more enemies than friends. It's the way they operate. So I know what you mean. It is hypocritical. It is.
It's hypocritical, but that's also people. I mean, people tend to not work that way. Like usually, if I do something that's hypocritical, other people will very quickly point that out, and then I will be forced to stop doing it. Either that, or I'll just stay the course, and over time that leads whatever way it does. But I guess governments can act that way, but their following doesn't seem to. It's just that we're so freaking disengaged and it's happening on such a high level, and there's no real recourse because we don't live in a functional democracy anymore. Anyway, I'm just lamenting the state of the world. I think we should get back to headlines here. President Joe Biden's administration is moving to revoke the designation of Yemen's Houthis as a terrorist group, citing the need to mitigate one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters. The center left, by the way, we'll be talking about Yemen again later towards the end of the show with our guest, Randy Nord. That'll be at 9:15 Eastern. The center-left candidate in Sunday's elections in Ecuador, Andres Arauz, has a lead over his conservative opponent, Guillermo Lasso. That election will be going to a runoff. We'll be talking about that with Professor Danny Shaw at 9:30 Eastern later in the show. The EU's foreign envoy, Josep Borrell, has said that Europe and Russia are drifting apart after returning from a visit in which he spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin and the country's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, who called the EU an unreliable partner. Regions across Greece have lost electricity after a fire broke out at a power station in Athens. The cause of the fire is unknown. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has pled not guilty to corruption charges in court for the first time as his trial resumes in Jerusalem. He is the first serving Israeli Prime Minister to go on trial, which takes place just a month before elections. Netanyahu, 71, is accused of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in 3 separate cases. Hundreds of protesters gathered outside the district courthouse ahead of the Prime Minister's brief appearance this morning, making noise, waving banners, and calling for him to resign. The Netherlands has called a halt to all new adoptions from abroad in reaction to a highly critical report which condemned the role of government officials and highlighted a wide range of abuses, including corruption, forgery, and child snatching. Egyptian authorities on Saturday freed an Al Jazeera journalist after more than 4 years in detention, his family lawyer said. Mahmoud Hussein walked free from a police station Saturday afternoon. That's a few days after a court ordered his conditional release pending investigations into charges of publishing false information and belonging to a banned group. And a massive search and rescue operation is underway in India after a part of a mountain glacier broke off, flooding a nearby hydroelectric plant and damaging construction of another dam that was being built nearby. At least 18 are dead and around 200 are missing. On Friday, the National Labor Relations Board rejected Amazon's attempt to delay a union vote set to begin on Monday, February 8th, as Amazon warehouse workers move to unionize. For many, the online giant's bid was seen as a stalling tactic, including a motion to demand votes take place in person, a clear health risk as the COVID-19 virus still poses a major threat in the United States and globally. And last night, the Buccaneers won their first Super Bowl since 2002. They became the first team to play and win a Super Bowl in their home stadium. The quarterback, 43-year-old Tom Brady, won his 7th Super Bowl, but first with a team other than the New England Patriots. He was also the oldest player to ever play in a Super Bowl. President Biden called into Super Bowl watch parties in Kabul and on the aircraft carrier the USS Nimitz to thank service members during the game. The social media website Reddit took out a 5-second Super Bowl commercial that included a shout-out to underdogs, an apparent nod to the recent Redditor-fueled GameStop investing frenzy. And with that, those were our headlines. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we'll be back on the other side of this break with our soapbox segment and Jamarl's monologue. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
Great shot. Even better. Let's get one more, just to be sure.
Are you a young photographer the world needs to know? Bring your images to more eyes through the Andre Stenin contest. Open to both artists and photojournalists, there are dozens of categories to enter and compete for a share of serious prize money. And, more importantly, international recognition of your work. Learn more about how to enter at stenincontest.com. Point, shoot, win.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. You can also join in on this conversation with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make sure what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I got to be honest, I have mixed feelings about the show of the one I want to do this morning. There are like 3, and so I'm just going to choose one and send the other ones for tomorrow. Joe Biden has put out a $1.9 trillion stimulus package, and in that package, he has something that is actually quite good. He has a $300 child credit. Now, the thought being that children are our future, supposedly, and how they go, so does our current society goes. Meaning, if you have a society and you want that society to be healthy, on some level, you need your kids to be healthy as they get older in this world. So that is a great policy, but it goes beyond just the cash. Meaning it's not just the $300. There are issues that extend far beyond just the cash. For example, one big example, especially when we're concerned, we care about our kids. This should never happen. This is CNN. 4 leading baby manufacturers knowingly sold baby food that contains high levels of toxic heavy metals, according to internal company documents included in a congressional investigation released Thursday. Quote, dangerous levels of toxic metals like arsenic, lead, cadmium, and mercury exist in baby foods at levels that exceeded what experts and government bodies said are permissible, said Democrat Representative Raja of Illinois, chair of the House Subcommittee on Economics, Consumer Policy, which conducted the investigation and signed Democratic lawmakers. It continues, the spreadsheet provided by the manufacturers are quote unquote shocking because they show evidence that some baby foods contains hundreds of parts per billion. Yeah, that's it. Hundreds of parts per billion of dangerous metals. Quote, yet we know that in a lot of cases, we should not have anything more than single digits per billion in any of these metals in our baby foods. Now, understand why. The reason is because a child, when they're growing and they're formulating their body, their brain chemistry, their the things that make them who they are on some level in a biochemistry way are in flux and are extremely sensitive to small outcomes, meaning these small amounts of metals that for them is not necessarily small at all, and yeah, environmental contagions. The point I'm trying to make here is that it goes beyond the 300. You have an issue in your particular society where we've allowed really horrible things to go on for years, and now we're trying this kind of modest proposal of change from the standpoint of the stimulus. Look, the 1.9 is great, but it's not entirely just the money. This is kind of the point I'm getting at. This gets worse. Arsenic, lead, cadmium, and mercury are in the World Health Organization's 10 chemicals of concern for infants and children. Now, right here, here's another interesting point. The U.S. Drug Administration has not yet set minimum levels of heavy metals in most infant food. The agency did not set standards of 100 parts per billion inorganic arsenic for infant rice cereal, but even that level is considered too much for baby safety. Critics say, especially when the FDA has already set a much lower standard of 10 parts per billion of inorganic arsenic in bottled water. So the amount of metals that is currently in the baby foods is higher than the amount that the Food and Drug Administration allows to be in bottled water for adults. That is astonishing. That's not just that, by the way. Chicago, we were talking about Lightfoot the other day. Well, Lori Lightfoot, before her, Rahm Emanuel. And if you remember, when Flint, Michigan had the big issue about the water crisis, you had all the lead in the water, they moved these pipes over, they didn't necessarily care because they were going into a poor neighborhood. Those people got ill, those people got sick, they were bathing in that water, and they had kids drinking that lead water. What happens to a child when it's drinking lead? Explain to me, what is the brain issues associated with that kid? What is the behavioral abnormalities? Can that kid learn in a way that a typical kid will learn after such like that takes place and destroys or augments their biochemistry? I am making the point that it's not just one thing or the other. It's a lot. The issue in Chicago and the issue in Flint, Michigan, both cities had issues of lead. Chicago buried the report on the Rahm Emanuel when it became known that they had lead in the water. It's not just about the money. There needs to be some honest recognition that if we want our society to prosper and to perpetuate itself forward, you have to take care of your kids. And I mean that figuratively, and I mean that almost literally. We as a society have a responsibility. I would argue that kids are a social responsibility. And I say that from the standpoint of, if I don't want that kid robbing, if I don't want that kid with depreciated brain chemistry, if I don't want that kid in a situation where he's looking to hit somebody over the head, then I want to ensure that that kid has a relatively decent life, and a stipend to the family is one way of doing it. But another way of doing it is also being honest about this stuff and being willing to go that route to fix this stuff. And while, you know, the 1.9 trillion from Biden, the stimulus package, is nice, it doesn't go far enough. And look, part of it is you're never going to let the bill go far enough just because of everything that goes wrong. But by the same token, I think it's not just the cash. That's the point I'm trying to make here. It's also the way we, in our politics, and how we treat our kids, how we treat one another, our feelings, our compassion to one another, any level of empathy, all of that stuff goes along with it. When Marianne Williamson, people laughed at her. They thought she was a joke of a political candidate. I didn't think Marianne Williamson was a joke of a political candidate. I think she's ultimately right. We try to engage in politics in this entirely cerebral way, just rational actors. And rationality is always tethered to something. It's not just floating in the wilderness. Everybody thinks their stuff is rational. Oftentimes, it may or may not be. From our standpoint, with pure rationalization in regards to our politics, you can get yourself in a mindset of what do I need to do to get ahead. You can scheme, you can, play the game in that way. You can get these complex 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional chess. All that stuff can take place. Her point, though, is it's not about theatrics. It's not about power. It's about what is in the best interest for our society so we can evolve as human beings. If you get stuck in the political space, you can get caught into this kind of gamesmanship, tit for tat type of politics, where what is in the best interest of the American public gets put onto the side, whereas you and your political interests and the people who are giving you that cash take forefront. Marianne Williamson basically makes this argument for spiritual politics. And I know that sounds woo-woo, that sounds a little strange, but when you think about it, what does she mean by it? I think what she's talking about is getting to this idea that some level of empathy towards one another as human beings. And it seems somewhere along the way that has been lost, if we ever had it at all. And I think a lot of that has come to culmination, honestly, with COVID. Whatever you thought your government would do in the case of an emergency, I have a hard time believing that what took place over COVID would be it. That is disastrous. And that bespeaks of a policy that didn't, again, care about the well-being of the public in favor of economic interests. That needs to change. And until the root of that thing changes, we are going to be in dire straits. These guys, these companies are incentivized to do just this. I know that sounds rough, that sounds horrible, and yet it's reality. Baby food, metals in our baby food. It's incentivized because basically their job is profit. The point of this is not baby food. The point of this is profit. Each one of those things has a certain amount of money that they make from it. If I have to make sure I get all that metal out, well, that's going to cause me more money, and that's going to adversely affect my bottom line. So let's just not do that, and let's just not say anything about that. No, you can't have it that way if you want a better society. So while I applaud the 300 for Biden and everything else, I do think we as a society have to look at ourselves a little bit differently and question, do we really care about our kids? If we do care about our kids, how do we show it? And if we're not showing it in the way that we're going about our affairs, do we actually care about our kids? I always run into questions with that. Because to me, if I cared about something, I would care enough about it to not do X or to do Y. And our society doesn't necessarily seem to be in that way. Economics takes precedence over everything, including our future, the babies. Shane, I don't know if you've seen this article. Came out CNN, I think it was like a day or so ago. And, you know, the idea that you could read an article and they're basically saying, yes, the companies decided to basically allow these metals to be in those foods. And, you know, the wild part about that is how many birth defects, how many mental illness things, how many items of childhood behavior anomalies can be placed at basically what those kids are inhaling or those kids are ingesting from their environment or, for this matter, from baby food. This is a disturbing story. What do you think?
It is disturbing. I agree. I mean, I'll put it like this, though. It was if you look back at how we've treated kids, how we've treated future generations over the course of the entirety of known human history, broadly, it hasn't been good. Broadly, whether it's like early child labor and putting kids to work, sometimes to death, or just how many kids have died historically, how rare it was for a kid to live from the age of 0 to the age of, say, 40 or 50. Most kids died fairly early on in their lives. It's only in the past couple of centuries that you've had a radical reduction, or really in the past century that you've had a radical reduction in infant mortality rates, child mortality rates in general. That's on the one standard. If you look at education, I mean, I would say that families by and large have tended to have better intentions towards kids than have governments. And it's only really in the last century, maybe in the early 20th century, that started to shift in some cases towards the other way around. And I still don't think it's true. I think that broadly families are going to treat their kids better than the government will. But if you look at education, I mean, mass education for children was conceived of first not as a way to enlighten people or to bring them up to some higher ethical or practical standard of basic human potential, deep human potential. It was basically there to create a workforce and a more or less pliant workforce for the rise of factories. You had a largely rural population that you needed to move to an urban core, and you wanted to sort of change how they thought and worked in their culture. And so schools became a useful factory-like mentality for factory-producing workers. Anyway, that's my own little tangent. This story is horrific, but it also fits in with our broader history of neglecting children, which, if you look at it from a more universal level, is really bad for humanity in general. If we cannot raise future generations, if you're talking about incentives, that's the most, in some sense, that is the most basic kind of incentive that you can have, or the most basic gradient of action that you can have. If you can make future generations more productive, if you can do whatever you can to make them better people, and you're talking about Marianne Williamson and spiritual politics, to make them kinder and more empathetic, all that stuff, then you should do that, of course. And it's just a matter of getting the incentives right. So this story is horrific. Anyway, I've gone all over the place there, Jamarl. We need to close this out. Any last thoughts?
Look, I think you're right. I think it does get to this notion of, people or families treat their kids better. Yeah, of course, right? I mean, the government wants these guys for war or whatnot. Oh, that's what it was. There's a book called The Dictator's Handbook, Buenos de la something. But he makes that argument that basically the reason that certain countries, especially countries like democracies or whatever, require voting and require work and jobs and all of those things is because they need that stuff for infrastructure. Whereas a dictator doesn't have to please anybody but himself. So if he's getting a ton of money, well, he doesn't necessarily need the populace to be on his side for that most. So he doesn't have to add infrastructure and all this other stuff in. For our country, it does. Work, labor, and all that stuff runs hand in hand. So it is very wild. I'm going to have to send you that book one day. Those are your headlines. Well, not your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment. Okay.
No Steven just yet?
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. By the way, you can catch us on the radio in Washington, D.C. We're on the air there, 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also on in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. And if you're digging what Jamarl and I are putting down, please do check us out on our various platforms. And we're going to be expanding very soon, too. We're on YouTube right now. You can go and search for either Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas. Check us out there. Do like and share those videos. Also subscribe to those channels, active chat rooms in each of those too. And if you want to join in on our conversation, you can feel free to do so. Send a chat, a tweet. You can also reach us by phone, of course, at 202-521-1320. So please do check, not just check us out. Join the call. join our conversation if you want to. Again, the number is 202-521-1320. We are currently, by the way, in the process of bringing on to air our next guest, Steve Drumbine, talking about a couple of things, including Biden's economic policies, $15 an hour minimum wage, this $300 per month child credit, this sort of child welfare policy, which I broadly am in favor of. A lot of people could do with more help raising kids. I mean, the only reason that people would push back on this one specifically, I think, it's not about incentives, because broadly there are very few people politically who want to publicly talk about disincentivizing having children. Most people seem to think having more kids who are raised better is a good thing. It's really just about the deficit and the GDP. And while there are arguments to be made there, I think that we could more than fund these things if we were to undergo budget cuts in other areas. So who am I to really push back on them? I just think at the same time, we should be cutting our spending on the military as things 1, 2, and 3. Those should be our sort of first lines of response. We do have a call while we're bringing Steve on. Let's go to Michael calling in from Sydney. Michael, you're on the line. What's going on?
Yeah, hi guys. Look, just a couple of things. Australia, for example, we've had child endowment, we call it over here, since the 70s, where we give families, they call it family tax benefit Part A and B. You can get up to, I think it's like $280 a fortnight for each child, and then it diminishes, it sort of goes down on a scale depending on how many children you have per child. And we've had that for over 30, 40 years, 50 years here in Australia. And but like Shane, I think unfortunately I have to disagree with you in terms of that matter of getting the incentives right. The incentives should be disincentives not to do it. So I mean, like for example, like, and there are a lot of problems in the world today. I mean, like the Monsanto is in our food supply now. You can't get it out; it's in the water. When the water gets evaporated, so Roundup, all that stuff goes up and then it comes down and it goes on all the crops all around the world. It's in the water supply. You can't get it out unless you reverse osmosis filter it all. So Roundup, the active ingredient that is Agent Orange, effectively, and they've known about the side effects of that in Vietnam for generations now. All these things. It's not. I mean, like there was Johnson and Johnson had asbestosis in its talcum powder. Putting deodorant under your armpits. It's full of heavy metals such as aluminium, which is linked to increased rates of lymph node cancer, breast cancer, Alzheimer's, things of that nature. Teflon, bottled water. I mean, even plastic is a carcinogen. Society is carcinogenic these days. Everything in society. I mean, the couch I'm sitting on has probably been sprayed with some type of, anti-flame thing and anti-flame repellent, which is probably carcinogenic. I mean, the whole entire world is toxic now. I mean, basically everything we produce in a modern day society is toxic. If it's got plastic in it, it's toxic. If it's been made in a factory, it's probably the toxins in it. The whole world is basically toxic now, so I mean, really, you had the case of the opioid epidemic in America. I mean, like for criminals, like for blue collar criminals who steal, a chocolate bar from the store, which by the way also has heavy metals in it, chocolate. Cadbury should be called cadmium. Basically, all these things that are floating. So you commit a crime, like in the criminal code, you go to jail. That's a disincentive to commit crime, right? And I'm not saying there should be incentives in place once you get out of jail to make sure you don't reoffend, and there should be incentives in society to make sure people become better humans and everything like that. But I mean, really, these people, corporate bankers who cause these mass calamities in society, the financial collapse, the ruin of economies, the mass unemployment, people go out and commit suicide and blow their heads out at home because they can't no longer feed their families, and families get thrown onto the street and they become homeless. I mean, you had Kamala Harris. She put people in jail for being truants from school, even though they were homeless. They had no fixed address. Their children couldn't attend school because they didn't have a fixed address. She boasted about putting single mothers of homeless children, mothers who are in jail. I mean, like people like this need this, like the heads of these corporations and the people who oversee this type of society. There should be a disincentive, and the disincentive should be jail. You go to jail and you do jail time. Right, hard jail time, like everyone else does hard jail time. None of these fancy federal farm prisons. Put them in a hard prison. Put them in there with the people they created and see how they get.
If corporations are people too, then why can't those, jail or corporate death maybe? If they're willing to, do something that run afoul of human life. I mean, this is a massive deal. That's horrific, horrendous. Thank you for calling, man. I really do appreciate the call. And yeah, I agree with you. Shane, what do you think?
I agree too. I still think people should have kids. I think that was what he called in to, say he was pushing back on at first. I don't mean to misrepresent Michael, but I agree with you on that part. The executives who are the main beneficiaries of the profit made by companies who are responsible for these things should also face responsibility. They should face legal responsibility. Not just for benefiting, of course, but for presiding over the process by which those decisions were made. So yeah, we need to have another look at how we can make that happen. Not just fines, but jail time. I'm in favor of that.
Let me ask you this: If we were more likely to put these heads of these companies in prison for doing stuff like this, do you think it would change corporate culture? Now think about what I'm asking, because at this point it puts a penalty on that stuff, like as opposed to just kind of going, oh, you're going to sue us for money that we can make in one day, instead of that. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, of course it would. I mean, it would, but it wouldn't just change corporate culture. I think it would change our culture in general. I mean, look, man, if you're not you, but if somebody gets put in prison, whether it's for like dealing drugs or frankly for murdering somebody, say you kill somebody, it's a crime of passion, and you get put in prison for that. And while you're in prison, you're trying to, personally repent. You might, you probably consistent, unless you want to go back into a life of crime, which frankly very few people, as far as I know, do. You're trying to sort of reconcile yourself with your past and improve on that. And then you look and you hear news stories while you're in prison about people doing these heinous things and getting paid for it, and they're getting fined. And the effect of the fine is basically to take away a fraction of their fortune. And meanwhile, their decisions have killed tens, hundreds, in some cases thousands or more people. If you're talking about our presidents, that number would be up into the millions pretty quickly. There should be more penalties at that high level. It would not just change corporate culture. Frankly, I think it would change our culture in general. I mean, that might seem like a little bit of a baroque or an oblique point, but it's real. It doesn't feel good to live in a society in which people who are at the bottom of society's rungs, on the lowest levels of that ladder, are getting charged for things that people on the highest levels would barely have to face a penalty for. It doesn't feel good to live in that society. We need to change that. We've got another caller. Let's go to, I believe this is Glavani in California. Glavani, you're on the air. Am I saying your name right? What's going on?
No, it's Giovanni. It's like the Italian guy, Giovanni.
Oh, Giovanni, you got a slight mistype here. What's going on, man?
Oh, that's cool. I just want. I'm watching your show. I hear you guys all the time. Want to know what I guess I came in at the wrong time with the wrong topic, but just want to let you go. I am running for Congress in California, District 27, coming up in 2 years. I'm challenging Judy Chu, and I follow you guys a lot. I don't know what to call myself. I'm not really a progressive, but I do agree with a lot of you guys. I just think that the Democratic Party right now is in such a state of turmoil. They're divided on many, many topics, and they're completely ineffective. And so one of the things I'm doing is I'm not going to run with the party. I'm running no party affiliation. I'm running not with Democrats, not with the Republicans. I'm only accepting individual donations from constituents within my district. No corporate money, no money from outside, just money from my constituents. And I'm Medicare for all. I'm cannabis reform, descheduling that, reducing the military budget drastically. Like, why do we have over 1,000 military bases all over the world? Like, I think Russia has 4, and, Italy has none, and, Italy can take care of its population in terms of healthcare because they don't have a huge expenditure.
Giovanni, quick question
on the military.
I appreciate you running for Congress,
Sure.
man. That is absolutely awesome. I think more people should do it. So definitely. And yeah, I agree with the policies, right? The Medicare for all, the cutting the military budget, the works. Question for you though: 90% of the races are won by the side with the most cash.
Sure.
Now, that's congressional races and whatnot. If that's true, then it's basically 9 out of 10. The person with more money gets it. It doesn't even matter the policy, and that's a problem in and of itself, right? So how do you? What do you see your chances are? And this is not to undermine the chances. I'm getting to something else. And if indeed your chances are lower because of the 90%, isn't that not an incentive to take cash in order to still get your agenda accomplished incrementally? I think that's the crux of the issue that people hit their heads on in politics. But I guess, what do you think about it? Like, how are you going to do that?
Okay.
That's what I'm asking.
Well, first of all, I think that, talking to people and getting their opinions, especially from ones your constituents, that people will actually be voting for you, are more important than the money you're going to be bringing in. Like, one conversation that you convince someone to vote for you, and they go and convince, 10 more people, and those people go, hey, you have to push a paradigm shift. You have to get away from the idea that people need to vote party over policy. You know, a lot of people in my district were highly democratic, and we're emotional voters. We vote for what we think is an emotionally the moral decision. But when the pavement, when the rubber meets the pavement, the policies are what get voted on. They get dismissed by people calling themselves legislators. You know, we have legislators who don't read the bills that they're voting on. I don't know who's writing them. So when it comes to the actual policy determining, you know, the day-to-day life of people in my district, there's a huge disconnect from how they feel they vote and the policies coming down from the government.
Perfect.
And that has to change.
I'm so glad you said that.
So
I'm so glad you said that. Because oftentimes, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, because listen, I've done the math. You know, I need about, realistically, I need about 100,000 votes for the primary, right? Now, let's just say I get 2,000 people. 2,000, you know, and you know, my district is fairly affluent. And there's 750,000 people in my district. Now, if I get 2,000 people to give me the maximum amount federally allowed by the government, that's 5.6 million dollars. That's a lot of money to run a campaign. It may not seem like much when you have unions and corporations throwing tens of million dollars at PACs and things like that, but I only need 100,000 votes.
That's not insurmountable. You know, that's your point. And look, there are plenty of other people, especially on the left. When they get elected, oftentimes they're doing it in a similar way that you're doing it. I mean, you know, AOC, who was the other one? It was somebody else. Sharma Shawant in Washington State, Seattle. Yeah, all of these guys are able to do it. So, no, I wasn't asking you that to undermine what you were trying to accomplish. No, I was more so curious about how you saw it and how you saw that almost like a paradox of sorts of trying to take power. You know what I mean? Thank you for the call, man. I appreciate it, Giovanni. Thank you for listening, and keep your ears here. So I really appreciate it. Let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. But joining us, we're still waiting on our guests, or do we have our guests here yet? Let's see. Okay, we're still bringing them in.
We're still bringing them in. We have another guest at this point.
I have a clip that I want to play.
Them in just a second.
And I guess the question I'm going to pose to you, Shane, is have the Democratic Party learned something? Whatever the something is, have they learned something? And is, what Biden doing over the last, month or so? I have to be honest, I think it's pretty good politics, despite the mental, cognitive stuff. Let's play this clip, because I'm going to say on some level, maybe incrementally, I think they did, especially from Obama, considering that they're taking a departure. Let's play the clip, Andre. Psaki.
American ideals. So we still keep the door open to seek ideas to make the package stronger from any Republican or other Democrats who want to bring them forward.
And given the president's remarks earlier and his change of tone, it does seem that he is now okay if this does happen just with Democratic support, despite those hopes and despite his calls for unity.
Well, first of all, the president ran on unifying the country and putting forward ideas that would help address the crises we're facing. He didn't run on a promise to unite the Democratic and Republican Party into one party in Washington. This package has the vast majority of support from the American public. This is something that people want. They want to see it pass. They want these checks to get into communities. They want this funding to go to schools. They want more money for vaccine distribution.
So now think back for a moment. Think back to Obamacare. And think back in the way that Obama was trying to get anybody, any Republican, and he watered his plan down over and over and over again and ended up still not getting any Republican support. So when Biden comes in and says bipartisanship, people are concerned and be like, oh my God, Joe Biden didn't learn anything. But maybe Joe Biden did learn a little something, that if he wants to stay in power and he doesn't want to lose the Senate and the House coming up, he is going to have to perform. And so it seems that he is willing to go through it by himself, whether Republicans help him or not. So yes, I think that's good. But we have a guest, Ted Rall, cartoonist. Excellent. Ted, how's it going, man? I'm doing all right.
Well. How are you
Ted,
doing?
Please give us a heads up on your background. We had to pull an audible. We had to pull an audible at the last minute when our guests didn't show up. So we're greatly appreciative for you to join us at this moment. Please tell people where they can find you and find your work.
Sure, I'm a syndicated editorial cartoonist, columnist, graphic novelist, and essayist. And you can find my work at my website, Rall.com, which will lead you to all sorts of other places all over the internet.
Excellent.
That's a good place to start.
And again, thank you, Ted. I appreciate the short notice. So I hope you heard the clip where Biden and his communication team basically just said, look, we'll go it alone if we need to go it alone. Yes, we'll talk about bipartisanship. We're going to talk about bipartisanship, providing you help us deliver for the American public. And if not, then we're willing to go it alone. And it seems that the public applauds. The public applauds that. So how do you view this? Is this something that these guys have just learned from Obama? I mean, he was in the administration. I would imagine he knew the frustration associated with, unyielding opposition to everything Obama does, including things that the Republican Party agreed with during that own election under John McCain. So is this the turn of a worm? Did these guys learn something? Or what do you think? What's your thoughts on this, Ted?
Well, Republican obstructionism goes back much further than Barack Obama. I mean, you can, I'm sure, talk to a man named Bill Clinton about how much Republicans allowed him to get done from a traditionally Democratic viewpoint. Joe Biden's been in Washington since the 1970s. He's seen all this. It's arithmetic. It's very clear that the Democrats can't get 60 votes in the Senate, and it's very clear that Mitch McConnell's Republicans are back at the strategy of trying to turn Biden/Harris into a one-term administration by not letting them get anything done. So, yeah, if they want to get anything done, they're going to have to go it alone. They had to make some noises in favor of bipartisanship because that's sort of expected, particularly by sort of very serious people in the punditry. But in the real world where they live, there's 50 votes in the Senate. They have to deal with Joe Manchin, who's sort of a Democrat in name only. So they're going to have enough trouble doing it that way. This is just reality. I'm glad to see that they recognize reality. As you mentioned, Obama didn't. They do. That's great.
So that's generally on where they are. That's on the issue of bipartisanship. What about specifically the economic policies? I just want to get your take on this. We were not optimistic going into a Biden presidency, and now look, people can disagree with it on the margins, and I'm sure many will disagree with it in full. But $15 an hour minimum wage. He's now pushing for the $300 child welfare checks, basically $300 a month per kid. And the $1.9 trillion stimulus plan, which while a far cry from the approximately double that was being bruited last summer by Congress, never got passed. It's nevertheless a lot larger than what Republicans want. What's your take on his economic policies in general? How do you think he's doing? And does this surprise you, Ted?
I would say I'm pleasantly surprised. I'm not wildly surprised. I think it's what he's asking for is too little across the board. I think that The economic hole is going to need to be filled by more than $1.9 trillion. The money needs to go into the economy yesterday, and it needs to be a lot bigger. People like Paul Krugman agree, but still, this is certainly more. I'm happy about it, and I think ironically, we're going to probably in the future find out that it was the Republicans who helped him get that way by trying to compromise. The Republican group of 10 senators who came up with their own plan, which was a tiny fraction of Biden's plan. It's kind of like when you go to a flea market and someone wants, you want to sell something for $19 and they offer you $5. You're probably not going to be able to arrive at a suitable sale price. And I think that sort of little episode kind of allowed them to sort of move forward. But the devil's always in the details. But yeah, I'm favorably impressed. That's not something I
there's
say
also
very
something
often.
that I've pointed to a while back that seems to be true, and I think we're seeing it now. That relative distance between the parties. They may fluctuate, but ultimately there's a relative distance that is maintained between the parties in this kind of conceptual space. So you would have somebody like an FDR, and the Republicans aren't like they are now. They were the Eisenhower Republicans, who basically, if you're not for the New Deal, you can get out the country. Well, imagine how far that has gone. And part of that has gone that far because the Democratic Party moved. Meaning, when they moved to the right, Republicans didn't say, okay, we'll just join hands and say kumbaya. They'd move further and further to the right. My point is, when Biden is putting forth this the stimulus or the $300 child credit, well, lo and behold, Mitt Romney comes out with his own plan that, it's not necessarily great, but he's talking about some kind of UBI getting rid of other services. But the fact that a Republican is talking about this is mind-blowing, and I strongly suspect it's connected to whatever Biden is doing here. Meaning, if the public is on board for what Biden is doing from the standpoint of a stimulus, it is politically treacherous territory to be against it. So, he stumbled upon good politics. Do you think this is, what do you think about that statement first, before I go further with that?
Well, I think that statement is 100% accurate, and history bears it out. Whoever sets the agenda is going to have the turf completely, on their side. And the Republicans have done that for the last half century. Everything's been discussed from a Republican, austerity, budget cut, social safety net slashing point of view. But when you institute popular policies, then the opposing party has to accommodate that. FDR was elected in 1932, pushed through the New Deal. By the time he ran for re-election in 1936 against Alf Landon ended up campaigning for many of the planks of the New Deal that FDR pushed through because he knew he had to. They were so popular with the American people. I suspect that if the Democrats continue in this vein with this sort of New Deal light kind of approach, the American people are going to remember, hey, this is what it feels like when your government does things for you when you're in trouble. I think I like it. That's a feeling they haven't had since the 1970s.
Well, in some sense, Trump pushed the party in that direction. He was the one who was battling with both Democrats and Republicans for larger stimulus checks. He was the one who was talking about the $2,000 stimulus checks. Never, it didn't come to pass, didn't actually manage to get it through, but he was pushing them in that direction. So I think you're right. I think we will see if Biden is able to get this stuff through, if his team is able to get this stuff through, I think we're going to see them getting moved in that direction. I'm curious. I want to turn to Trump for a second, who has been remarkably silent and who will not be testifying at this week's Senate hearings over his impeachment, just to throw that in there. How else, we've only got a minute or two left, Ted. How else do you think Trump will have affected the Republican Party? Do you agree with my assessment that he might have moved them on economic issues? And, if so, on what other grounds do you think he's changed them, other than all the conspiratorial nonsense? Ted?
I had really hoped that Trump would show up to defend himself and wearing a beard like Saddam at his trial. But, I digress. It was, I think the Trump effect is exactly the way you described. He was an unorthodox Republican. And I think he kind of points the way to Republicans to reconsider the Reaganism that has dominated the party and the corporate wing for all these years. It is possible to have a government from a Republican point of view, that is generous to the American people and has concerns for individuals beyond just telling them that they have to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Trump understood that on a very visceral level. Trump's been silenced because of his Twitter feed being blocked, but we haven't heard the last of that impulse, and you can see that in large part by the fact the reluctance in the Senate to convict him. He's still a very big force in the party, and I think people are still processing him.
Yeah, agree.
Ted, we've got to close it out. Thank you so much for, definitely agree. Thank you so much for being willing to join us, especially on such short notice. Hope you're having a good morning, and it's good to hear from you.
Anytime.
For those listening, that was Ted Rall, political cartoonist, syndicated columnist, and graphic novelist. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall. Check out his cartoons and articles at rall.com. That's RALL.com. And also be on the watch for his upcoming graphic novel he is working on with a friend called The Stringer, which he has previously told us is like a journalist meets Breaking Bad. I forgot to, only had so much time this morning. I forgot to bring that up. I do want to hear more about that at some point. Anyway, be on the watch for that. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a short break at the end of this hour, and we will be back on the other side in just a minute with headlines and the last 2 hours of today's show. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst,
and that means
James
you're listening
Stranahan.
To Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Excellent. Let's go to the news. Go to the headlines. In the news, at least 1,299 new coronavirus deaths and 87,727 new cases were reported in the United States on February 7th. Over the past week, there's been an average of 117,993 cases per day, a decrease of 31% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Monday morning, more than 27 million people in the United States have been infected with COVID-19, and over 463,000 people have died. Yeah, I'm beginning to think you're right, Shane. Those numbers do seem to be going down. So that's fair. Let's hope they stay that way. South Africa has temporarily canceled its rollout of AstraZeneca's vaccine. Now, this is due to a study released on Sunday which showed the vaccine provided only minimal protection against a local variant of the coronavirus circulating in the country. A spokesperson for AstraZeneca said the company was working closely with South African Ministry of Health and said it still believes the vaccine will provide protection against the worst effects of the new B.1.351 variant. China's National Health Commission announced today that for the first time in about 2 months, its mainland recorded no locally transmitted COVID-19 cases. The country recorded a total of 14 new cases on Sunday, but it was determined to be infections brought back from overseas. The report also said that Beijing does not count asymptomatic cases. More than 1,500 more elderly residents in New York State adult care facility died from COVID-19 than the official previously reported, a new report reveals. The number, accounting for an 8-fold leap over the 219 deaths reported earlier from the facilities, comes as state officials adjusted the figures to reflect adult care patients who died in hospitals rather than the centers themselves. The revelation also comes one day after state health officials also quietly updated their statistics for nursing home deaths from the pandemic to reflect an additional 4,067 patients who died in hospitals. Yeah, we were speaking about that earlier in the segment. Cuomo got a lot of support and credit after New York. And if you remember, think back, they were calling him presidential. Donald Trump was giving his clown car of a information briefing. Cuomo would go out, he would give his briefing. They was like, wow, that guy seems presidential. And then you find out the policies that he was putting in place, shutting the government down too late, sending people to nursing homes without those people being tested to see if they had an illness. Not to mention that, even worse, not allowing the testing or mandate to allow those guys to test. And then you find out that it was undercounted. Cuomo say he sleeps easy at night. I don't know how. I don't know how. I don't know why. Let's keep going. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot and CEO of Chicago Public Schools have announced a, quote, tentative agreement, unquote, with Chicago Teachers Union. Under the plan, which has not yet been formally approved by the union, pre-K students will head back to school on Thursday, February 11th. Kindergarten through 5th grade teachers and students will return March 1st. And 5th through 8th teachers and students will be back March 8th. It is currently unclear when the union will vote on the issue. Shane, so you and I had this conversation with Bill Ayers Friday. And, you know, there was this kind of, he was giving this kind of backstory to the stuff that was taking place and the friction between Lori Lightfoot and the teachers, who basically are concerned about their safety, the safety of their kids, and the safety of the people that work in those schools. So the fact that they got a deal going, I suppose that's good. I think it's weird that you get a deal in advance of ensuring that the numbers are low enough for those kids to go back to school. But, you know, I suppose they're working out a deal. What do you think about this? I mean, is this, you know, like March 8th is just around the corner? And I can kind of see it if the numbers are like extremely low and there's not this worry or concern about transmission at higher rates and stuff like that. But I don't know if we're there yet. And so I'm edgy or sketchy about this. But by the same token, I would imagine the teachers want to work and they want to get back to the job. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, or they want to continue to teach at home when that's happening, and they're probably worried about getting COVID. And like we were talking about with Bill Ayers, there's also the staff to take into consideration. It's not just the teachers, it's not just the students, it's also the various members of the staff servicing the buildings and helping out. So there are multiple parties there. I agree with you. It's too early. In my opinion, this adds a little bit of confusion to the situation, but you probably want it to be set on a district by district basis where you're monitoring local COVID cases. And then if certain districts are very low, maybe you pick it back up. To argue against that, though, it's not just that it's more confusing. You'd have to check in with your district. It's not like you'd have a citywide announcement that could service all the schools. That adds confusion. There's also the fact that in general, when the cases go down again and you start to open things back up, you get the yo-yoing where you get back to some new level of normal. It's like we're willing to sacrifice temporary gains we've made just to make up for it in other areas. Now, on the one hand, that makes perfect sense from a sort of utilitarian analysis. That's the kind of thing you do. On the other hand, it means that we're in this constant state of limbo. And going into summer, the hope was, really going into spring now, but going into summer after that, the hope was you'd have vaccines kicking in. That would be helping out. And a little bit later this year, not too much later this year, you'd be returning to some sense of normalcy. Ideally, the problem is we now have these new rogue strains circulating that appear to be more infectious and that might counteract the vaccines. And in addition to that, we've also had problems with vaccine procurement and deployment. So the situation is not as rosy as it wasn't in December, in November and December, looking to the rollout of the vaccines. But we thought, hey, there might be a hope that this stuff would be resolved. At this point, it's really uncertain. So that's the sort of wider picture. But with schools specifically, I would argue that is too early. I would argue, and one thing we didn't include in this headline is part of the debate is over the vaccine rollout at schools, and that of course is part of the larger, problem we've had procuring and deploying vaccines as quickly as we could be doing. So, more to talk about there later.
That's
I'm sure.
The point. The AstraZeneca, the variant, basically doesn't work all that well against one of the variants. I'm sorry. One of the vaccines doesn't work all that well against the variant. That's unfortunate. I mean, because you have, multiple variants now. It's like 4 or 5 different variants. And each seems to have these kind of different, outcomes or different drugs that might work better than others for them. Yeah, that's a little disturbing, especially if that continues to kind of mutate. There is something here, though. The COVID-19 thing. The thing that's that's wild to me about COVID, it's almost like an allegory for resources. Basically, you have a finite supply of something. You have nations around the world that want to get their hands on that. And on top of that, you have other nations that are much smaller, much weaker, and those nations also don't necessarily think it's fair that the vaccines are going to go to the wealthier countries first. By the same token, no wealthy country is going to give it out without their own population being inoculated. That's the fastest way to lose an election because your opposition is going to attack you mercilessly for it. So it's almost like we're back to this thing of like a scramble for resources. And what does it look like when there's a scramble for resources? Basically, the stronger hand grabs it. So yeah, it's very weird, especially with the variants now around the world, because it's not that straightforward of this vaccine does it. But let's just hope, it doesn't necessarily get so out of whack where they're not working. Houston, Texas leaders, Houston, Texas leaders unveiled a 2-block mural Saturday dedicated to George Floyd and located directly in front of his alma mater, Jack Yates High School. The Biden administration will move today to rejoin the United Nations Human Rights Council nearly 3 years after President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from it. In an interview on CBS yesterday, President Joe Biden says the United States does not need to engage China as a direct adversary. He complimented Xi Jinping on some personal qualities while criticizing him on politics. So let's play the clip. We have this clip. I love this clip.
He's very bright. He's very tough. He doesn't have, and I don't mean as a criticism, just a reality, he doesn't have a democratic small d bone in his body, but he is, the question is, I've said to him all along that we need not have a conflict, but there's going to be an extreme competition. And I'm not going...
Competition. It's less belligerent. But I got to be honest. Even though I don't think Joe Biden is going to take the tack that Trump took with China, I have a hard time believing that he's not necessarily going to go with the Asian pivot that Obama was going with, or something like it, in order to try to compete from a business or economic standpoint. What do you think, Shane? These situations like this concern me a little bit, only because sometimes these fights over economy turn into other type of fights that become hot, not necessarily just in rhetoric and whatnot. But I would say the words sound nice. I don't know what they mean entirely. so what are your thoughts?
Part of what this is Biden trying to distinguish himself from Trump. It's interesting because I could see Trump also starting by calling Xi Jinping very bright, very tough. I could see him using literally exactly the same words. That wouldn't surprise me all that much because he does tend to compliment his foes. But at the same time, Biden will be softer, and Biden won't engage in the direct economic trade war like Trump was. He's trying to make that clear. Another thing here, and this isn't new, but it's just worth stating, I suppose, extreme competition. What is inherent in that statement is that we see China as a worthy opponent in some sense. We're not the official policy here has already, we're talking about the pivot to Asia last week with our guest talking about Myanmar. We've already been engaged in the process of trying to compete with China, but it has been less direct. And then Trump brought it to a much more direct economic war, and Biden is now sort of reiterating that and making it clear we are in direct competition with China. So again, I mean that's already obvious for anybody who's been watching this stuff. That's been very clear, but it's just worth stating. He made that point himself in that phrase, extreme competition. Anyway.
Totally. President Joe Biden administration is moving to revoke the designation of Yemen's Houthis as a terrorist group, citing the need to mitigate one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters. Now, we talked about this one Friday, too, briefly, where basically Biden gave a speech saying, he's not necessarily going to be involved in the Yemen war. However, he's going to be helping and backing up the Saudis. We weren't sure how you were going to square that circle, but nevertheless, that's what Biden was saying. The center-left candidate in Sunday's elections in Ecuador, Andres Arauz. Shane, what's that last name? A-R-A-U-Z? Okay.
I believe it's Arauz.
Leads let's try this again. The center-left candidate in Sunday's election in Ecuador, Andres Azur, led over his conservative opponent, Guillermo Lasso, but the election will be going to a runoff. Ecuador is a beautiful country. I was there several years ago. The EU's foreign envoy, Josep Borrell, has said that Europe and Russia are drifting apart, unquote, after returning from a visit in which he spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin and the country's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, who called the EU a, quote, unreliable partner. Regions across Greece have lost electricity after fire broke out at a station in Athens. The cause of the fire is unknown. And we'll go to one more. This will be the last. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has pled not guilty to corruption charges in court for the first time at his trial, as his trial resumes in Jerusalem. He is first serving Israeli Prime Minister to go on trial, which takes place just a month before elections. Mr. Netanyahu, 71, is accused of bribery, fraud, breach of trust in 3 separate cases. Hundreds of protesters gathered outside the district court ahead of the Prime Minister's brief appearance this morning, making noise, waving banners, and calling for him to resign. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're currently joined by Vasudevan Sridharan, an experienced journalist based in South India who writes on current affairs, geopolitical equations, the environment, startups, and the economy. His works have appeared in several Indian and global publications. Vasudevan, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning? Hey, can you hear us, Vasudevan? All right, it sounds like we're having a little bit of a hard time. We'll try to get into this conversation in just a moment. We're talking about the ongoing farmer protest, as well as the story of Greta Thunberg, who's best known as a sort of environmental activist opposing nuclear power in favor of large-scale action to prevent climate change, who came to the forefront and to public attention within the past couple of years, basically for fiery speeches railing against the state of politics and how decrying how they've been choosing to deal with the environmental crisis here. And then the story is, and I'll let Vasudevan explain it for us in a little bit more depth once he's successfully on, that basically she accidentally tweeted information that she was effectively given to tweet, basically like a PR release, a sort of toolkit telling her what to say. She quickly deleted that tweet and then reposted a slightly different variation of it, but this time intentionally. And it revealed, again, that she was effectively being told what to say by an outside group. The Indian government has responded to this. And in that sense, it just makes it an interesting story. But of course, the farmers' protests are ongoing. And part of the story, part of the narrative, at least, that I want to hear from Vasudevan is that those protests are increasingly being co-opted by outside actors who are trying to use them to pursue their own political aims, specifically opposing the government of Narendra Modi. So interesting story. I hear we're having some technical issues with the delay with Vasudevan. We're trying to get that worked out, because that would not make a good conversation. But Jamarl, have you been following this? We were talking about this last week briefly.
Yeah,
so,
I mean,
what are your thoughts?
It's really interesting. How old is Greta Thunberg? For just before I even start, she's what? She's a teenager, right?
I believe she's 18 now. I think she was like 16, 17, something like that. When a lot of attention was thrown on her, but now she's 18, I believe.
It's just a little weird that a teenager would have this much. I don't know what I'm looking for. Like that much attention. Like, because when she was younger, it felt like she was being thrown out there for the environmental movement. Now, clearly, I'm for environmental movement, right? But it's a little weird when you throw a kid out there because people don't like hitting kids. So it makes it just strange. Also for this, she's putting out like a toolkit, apparently. And Modi is arguing or making an argument that they're basically, this is kind of some kind of foreign internal, attack on the country in some kind of weird way. So yeah, it's very, very strange. But I don't know, like, I'm curious on who gave her that. I'm even curious on why she decided to do that. Is it just because she's looking at farming and she thinks farming is associated with environment? Like, is it that straightforward and that shallow? I don't know. This was just a very weird story in general.
I mean, I could speculate. You can kind of guess how these things would work, which is she becomes a political figure. She has one issue that she thinks is important. This issue kind of overlaps with that, farming, climate change.
He's on.
I don't know. You know what I'm saying. And then she decides to branch out. She gets brought into it, and she doesn't know that much about it. And so she's working with this organization who either brought her into it or who's recommending stuff now that she's on it. That's obviously speculation, but it kind of does make sense of it to me. She's trying to use her political clout for issues that she also supports. I'm not alleging that she's getting paid or anything like that. Anyway, we do now have our guest on. Vasudevan, are you with us?
Yeah. Please go ahead. Sorry, there's some problem with the connection.
No worries, not your fault. Thank you again for being with us. All right, we were just talking about Greta Thunberg and this issue of her accidentally sharing a tweet, accidentally tweeting a toolkit that she had received from this Canadian organization. She deleted that and then reposted another one. Anyway, I know that this has been received rather strongly in India. I know that back in the States, Rihanna has started to talk about this, and celebrities in India have started to talk about this, and they have actually filed a criminal. It started a criminal investigation, not into Thunberg herself, but into what she was sharing. Can you give us how is this being received? What are the facts on the ground there, as far as you can tell, on this story, and how is this being received by Indian press and by the Indian government? What's been going on there, Vasudevan?
What you've described is absolutely accurate. The toolkit was, I'm not entirely sure whether that was accidentally shared, because after she tweeted the toolkit, she said she stood by it, and we've now received an updated version. The Indian government is absolutely livid with such developments, and most likely rightly so. Indian press is equally not happy with it. Some sections which are known to be anti-establishment, anti-government are celebrating such developments. I'm not sure why. Without going into the merits of those, the government's response is shows a lot. A lot of celebrities have been marshaled, especially cricketers, Bollywood celebrities. They have been marshaled to tweet against both Rihanna's and Ms. Thunberg's tweets. Those seem well orchestrated. All these tweets have come within a very short span of time, and they all look alike. People have pointed out these are not independently posted. They are genuinely pushed by the government, and most likely all these celebrities who tweeted are in sync with the government. And rightly so, yeah. But the government, these people do not, those who are voiced against the Indian government from overseas, I'm not entirely sure how much they would know about it. If I'm not wrong, there are some, if some of the sources are correct, the intelligence agencies suspect some of these are, I think it's Rihanna's tweet was a paid tweet by...
Really? You're saying that the Indian government suspects that Rihanna's tweet was paid for. How did they announce that? I'm just curious how that came out.
Not on the official one. Definitely not on the record. One of the some of the official sources in the intelligence agencies suspect she was paid by a Canada-based pro-separatist group of a set amount, and then she tweeted it. I'm not entirely sure. This is absolutely an unconfirmed report, but this is a serious allegation.
So it's a rumor. Yes, no, but that is it. That's a serious allegation. That's why I jumped on it and why I wanted to follow up on that. And I'm guessing that the organization in Canada you're talking about, that's the Poetic Justice Foundation, from which Thunberg received the toolkit that she tweeted. Is that right?
Yeah, but this one is a different one. Poetic Justice Foundation is the one which put together the toolkit. But this is a different one. So we're not entirely sure whether this is credible, but this is a serious allegation. That's why the government's response is definitely up to the mark. That's why they are livid about it. It is called one of the PR firms, if I'm not wrong, Skyrocket, based in Canada. That's what they say. I paid about, let's say, $2.5 million to Rihanna to tweet in support. These are still in the rumors world. We do not know how credible this is, but the government is taking this seriously.
Question: how much of this is just politics? So, like you said, Narendra Modi, he is apoplectic. And I'll just read a statement. They say launches a scathing attack. International conspirators who are out to discredit India without directly taking the names of the Swedish environmental activist Greta Thunberg, who shared basically the toolkit. Like you said, he said, quote, "We're responding to the conspiracies with all of its might." So they're basically saying, look, this is not entirely an internal dilemma. This is internal politics is being agitated by outside forces. Now, I've heard that before, and sometimes that's true, right? But it's always not the easiest thing to discern whether or not that's true or not, or whether or not the government is just using that as a political touchstone to get out of a sticky situation. Mm-hmm. Which one do you see this as more than anything else?
Mm-hmm. In these two instances, both Rihanna and Greta's tweets, the government is more or less right in voicing their. They're warranted to be unhappy about it, and I'm not entirely sure both these personalities whether they understand why they are protesting, why the farmers are protesting, and whether it's such a complicated subject. It's not like what we saw in the US Capitol riots. We all can agree that the riots were wrong, but not in this case. The farmers' issue in India is a complicated subject. There are too many layers. These are multi-layered problems. This is not a black and white area. There's a gray one. So people taking sides should be a little more knowledgeable and equipped to back their information, back their claims. So the government is rightly is in the right position to take on these people.
Okay, so to somebody who's just sort of peripherally paying attention to this, I will admit the Indian government's language sounds a bit strong, and I want to get your take on this because it seems like part of what we've heard is that it's not just the farmers' protest; it's that is that certain international actors as well as probably national actors inside of India are trying to use those protests to push what they want, which is effectively a unified opposition to the Narendra Modi government. But again, you have prominent people, and Indian Minister V.K. Singh saying that Thunberg's tweet, quote, revealed the real designs of a conspiracy at an international level against India, quote unquote. So that's strong language. What justifies that in your perspective, Vasudevan?
We do not know. We have no evidence to suggest as yet there's any international conspiracy to work against India or any such. We do not have any people. Those who allege such remarks, they haven't given us any substantive evidence. But the government is extremely conscious of how its image is being projected outside. Both this is even more important in the current scenario where the economy is badly hit. The government wants to take both political and economic mileage from the changing world order. China is not in a great shape politically speaking. They do not have a great name. India wants to capitalize on those. There's a change in the US administration. The Brexit has just happened. India wants to expand its both politically and wants to take advantage of these situations. So these are exactly the echoes of India's attempts and ambitions outside the world. These do not, we can't take these literally, any of these politicians' remarks, unless they offer us some credible evidence to back their
Exactly.
claims.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Exactly. I guess that's kind of what I was getting at. It's like it's hard to know what's legit, especially when the government has a lot of pressure on it, and it's looking for ways to absolve itself of that in front of its own public. Let's do this. I'm gonna take you out for an early break because we only have like a minute and a half in this particular segment left, and I'm gonna bring you back. Yeah, I'm gonna bring you back. So the voice that you guys are listening to is Vasudevan Sridharan, an experienced journalist based in South India who writes for Current Affairs, Geopolitical Equations, Environmental Startups, and Economy. His work has appeared in several Indian and global publications. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? We're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us for a conversation on the protests that are still growing and occurring in India is Vasudevan Sridharan, an experienced journalist based in South India who writes on current affairs, geopolitical equations, environment, startups, and economy. His work has appeared in several Indian and global publications. And again, Sridharan, welcome to the show. We appreciate you talking to us about this. Thanks. Protests. Now, I want to, for a moment, kind of use what's taking place in France, or what was taking place in France under the Yellow Vest movement, to kind of question this. The Yellow Vests had around 70% support at one point, meaning from the standpoint of the crowd and the audience, meaning the people who weren't out on the streets were still backing them to the tune of like 70%. What has been the experience going forward with the farmers' protests? Meaning, where did it start, and how has it gone over the time from the public sentiment of this protest over, let's say, the last several months?
Well, from September, October, since the laws were passed, there's without necessary discussions both inside and outside the parliament, especially in the middle of a pandemic, where such platforms, the opportunities to set up those discussion platforms are severely limited. The Indian government enacted the laws. Those were major reforms, more or less bringing in the private sector. Farmers are largely unhappy with it, especially those who are located in the northern parts of the country, not so much in the southern part. They are the private sector, especially in agriculture, is always seen with a skeptic eye. They are not welcomed. The protests snowballed in the capital, Delhi. The public sentiments have largely been with the farmers over last several months. But now people have started to take these protests with a large pinch of salt because of what had happened in late January on the Republic Day, January 26th. Although this was not a large-scale violence, People have been rioting. There have been some skirmishes. There were some unexpected, unnecessary, unwarranted events which could have spiraled out of control into a bigger problem. So a large portion of these had emerged from the pro-farmers sections, from these campaigners. So the public sentiments and what we see in the newspaper reports, media sections, and the comments have largely been little more, let's say, reduced, although not in favor of the government, but not entirely in chorus with the farmers. That's the current mood right now. And a couple of farmers associations, unions have backed out after what had happened in January. They say, regardless of who was the actual cause of these untoward incidents, people have backed out from the protest. But many people are still in the protest mode.
And let's go back to what happened in January for just a second. I also want to talk about Twitter, and from what I can tell from the outside, the suppression of people on Twitter with employees of the company blocking prominent journalists in India, unblocking them after getting pushback, and now facing up to 7 years in jail time from Modi's government. I want to come back to that. But in January, I believe it was January 22nd, it was not too long ago, just a couple of weeks ago, there was this massive wave of basically unprecedented violence, at least in the course of these protests, where nearly 100 protesters were injured in clashes with the police. One protester died. Now, again, speaking from the United States, we had the Capitol breach earlier on in January, and at the current standing, 5 people died. I don't even know what the count is, the number of people injured, but I'm sure a lot. Dozens of police officers injured. So I don't want to act as if India is the center of political unrest right now, but in the context of these protests, this was a significant event. How did that seem to happen? What have been the consequences of that so far, Vasudevan?
This was a planned march on January 26th, India's Republic Day, where we usually have the parade of all the wings of the armed forces. We parade those whatever the latest warfare equipment we have. So to counter that, as a symbol, farmers plan to have their own parade of tractors in the capital. The government, both the Delhi government and the central government, went back and forth whether to give them permission or not. At the end of the day, the courts gave farmers permission, farmers unions the necessary permission to parade for the tractor parade in the capital. What had happened was there was no coordination between the farmers unions, associations which were protesting in Delhi so far. A lot of people forgot their routes, their planned routes, or either deliberately or inadvertently. Couple of them gate crashed the borders, the state borders, earlier than planned. So the police were taken aback. Security forces couldn't handle that situation. People got enraged when they were blocked further, and it simply spiraled out of control. No one expected that it would be a smooth march. There were some definitely unhappy incidents. There was a footage of allegations flew from both sides that the unrest was created by some mischievous elements planted by pro-government forces, but the farmers say that the government says these were the original intentions of some of the farmers, separatists, etc. There was one footage which was circulating, not verified. I'm not entirely sure, but it was sort of verified that police security forces were seen destroying the CCTV cameras so that the protesters can be handled properly. So, yeah, the rumors were quite rife.
I hear you on this one. Let's talk about Twitter for a minute. In general, the shutdown of the internet. Internet shutdowns are a little bit more common, I think, in that part of the world than in this one. The Indian government has previously shut down the internet in Kashmir. And for those wondering, the tweet that Rihanna sent out was actually talking about the prospect of internet shutdowns, basically saying, who does this? I'm paraphrasing her tweet. This comes also, they may be preparing to shut down the internet again soon as these protests have continued. Twitter also started to suppress some people's candidates, some people's accounts, blocking their accounts on Twitter, specifically journalists and activists in India. Then they undid those bans. They brought people back in. And now Modi's government has threatened them with up to 7 years in prison, some of the employees of Twitter in that country. What, in your opinion, what's your take on this? Is that broadly accurate? What's the Indian public's response to this ban? How widely used is Twitter in India? How important of a tool is it? And where do you think this is going? Vasudevan.
Twitter is not the mainstream social media platform in India. It's either Facebook or predominantly WhatsApp. This is where most of the protesters or protesters organize. Twitter is more of a broadcasting platform for others. Those are not meant for networking. Twitter is not meant for networking, at least in India. This is more of a threat. They don't. They might not mean it literally. They would jail people or others. They might penalize. The government might do that. But this is more of a threat rather than implementing it to the word. Of course, we have seen this with other giants as well, Twitter or Facebook or any other, Amazon, any other any giant you can call. When it comes to India, especially in this government, people are, we can't say afraid, but they do tread cautiously when it comes to this government, because end of the day, their business interests will be jeopardized if they don't if they make this government unhappy. So a lot of money involved in it. So obviously, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or anyone else, they will listen to the government.
Vasudevan, where do you think this is going ultimately? I mean, this protest has been going for a while now. Meaning, how do you think this is going to resolve? Do you think the government is going to give in on the demands? Or are the protesters going to give in? Or are they going to meet somewhere in between? How do you see this breaking down? Do you think they can outlast the government's will on this front?
I'm reminded of a clever line from a translation. How do you kill a cow, but you don't get the blame? You don't cut its neck. You just let it bleed. That's what essentially the government is doing. The government has offered some terms. They've said they're ready to pass laws for the next 18 months. They've given the offer. They hope the protesters do not have enough resources to go on with the protest for a very long time. Obviously, no one will have. Even the best of the movements cannot sustain this kind of street rallies of this magnitude in cold winter. Delhi winters are known to kill people, literally. So the government hopes that this will die down soon. It's only a matter of time. In January, the farmers were seen to be in a very strong position, but as the weeks have gone, they are in a very disadvantageous position right now.
Let's go. You know what? Let's go to a slightly early break. Vasudevan, I want to thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Appreciate you being willing to be with us.
Thanks so much, both of you.
For those listening, that was the voice of Vasudevan Sridharan, an experienced journalist based in South India who writes on current affairs, geopolitical equations, the environment, startups, and the economy. His works have appeared in several Indian and global publications, and you can follow him on Twitter at Vasu_Sridharan. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment with our call-in segment, Whose Fault Is It Anyway?, talking about important issues and who's responsible for them. Be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us, this is going to be an open segment, so you can call us 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement is going to make this segment what it is. You guys have asked for more call-in segments, so here we are. I want to get into this issue of China as an adversary. Now, I think this is going to be a key point over the course of the next 2 and even 4 years. And I would even argue going forward in perpetuity, because I don't believe you can put the toothpaste back into the tube. And this goes a little bit beyond China, and I would even add Russia into this. And I'm talking about an issue of world peace and whether or not world peace is even possible in the way that we organize ourselves. Or, for that matter, because of the, let's say, antagonisms and the competition that is built into the way we have to get resources, is it impossible in and of itself? Going back for the moment to the Soviet Union, you had this moment where it looked like there was a chance for the world to come together in this kind of peace of sorts, where everybody at the very least recognized that people had their own interests and their own spheres of the world and everything else. And somewhere along the way, that ended. NATO expanded, Bill Clinton specifically. This reminds me a lot of that in an odd way. You have Biden who's basically saying the United States does not need to engage China as a direct adversary. He complimented Xi Jinping on his personal qualities while criticizing his politics. He doesn't have a small democratic bone in his body. Well, he doesn't need a small democratic bone in his body for this country and for the other countries to have some level of understanding of, let's say, what can I call it? Understanding of spheres of influence. And until that understanding of spheres of influence takes place, this gets to the whole hypocrisy argument again. Conflict will be endemic. Shane, do you agree with that? Like before, meaning until we get to a point where I can recognize that you have a certain sphere of influence based on, I don't know, whatever kind of factors that are available. And without that, it's conflict. In fact, not just conflict, it breeds conflict. Because I'm going to get closer into your territory. I'm going to encroach further on your space. I'm going to take provocative actions to ensure that economic, or for that matter, military, will have difficult time, meaning from your standpoint or from the other country's standpoint, articulating their country's wants. And so it's like, if there's any chance for us to having a coming together from the standpoint of the world, especially the larger powers, there has to be some understanding of that. And for whatever particular reason, it seems that that is not acknowledged. It is small for Biden to say adversary. We don't have to deal with him as a direct adversary, but he is dealing with him as an adversary. And I think that's the key point. How do we, as a world, as a country like this, come together when there is a very specific interest, be it economic, be it geopolitical, or for that matter, be it military, for countries and their civilizations, this kind of tribal politics. How do we get past it? And is it even possible to get past it? What do you think, Shane?
I don't think it is possible to get past it. That might be my personal take. I think that you can get away from it, but I'll put it like this. It's not just the government. It's not just that the American government or the Chinese government wants more power, and so they're competing with other countries for more power. You have the investor class, which want more certainty about where they can outlay money in order to get more assured returns on their investments. So if you're an investor who's primarily based in America, or you're an investor who's primarily based in China, you want to be able to know that you can invest in some operation either within that country or outside of that country, and know that you're going to get a profit, have some reasonable certainty that you're going to get the return on that investment that you expect. And in order to do that, what you want is for the prevailing political order that you're a part of and that you're counting on to succeed. I think that is often missed as a sort of main motivator for international action. Anyway, I don't think we're going to get past that. I think that it's not just basic human nature. It might be almost like thermodynamical nature or something like that. But that's a little bit too murky. I'm not gonna dwell on that. I think it comes down to something deeper than merely human tendencies. I think it's like evolutionary, that you have these competing spheres of influence between clades of different entities competing for power. Coming back up to the surface level, it's an interesting thing. The title of the segment is "Whose Fault Is It Anyway?" And we actually haven't even posed the question of whose fault this is. I think partly because this is not a problem. China's rise to power, quote unquote, or return to power, comes along with a massive uplifting of people, hundreds of millions of people from deep poverty. On that level, it's an unmitigated human good, I'd say. But of course, that's not all. You can also be worried about, and I am worried about, politically where China has gone, and that in the long run, if not in the short run, they're going to have to start to deal with some serious issues with domestic censorship and the propagandization of their public. Now, we do that too. I'm not trying to single them out. We do that all the time, and we're doing it more than ever. But as far as whose fault is China's rise, again, I don't know if it's a problem exactly, but if it is, I would say it's ours. I would say it's the American government's fault and our corporations when we decided to lean on them economically with the opening of China in the early 70s. Or you could say that it's Deng Xiaoping's fault back in the 70s for his efforts to modernize China and to bring it back, not only diplomatically with the rest of the world, but to bring it up to the rest of the world's standing, where he went on a visit to Japan, was extremely impressed by what he saw there, chose to broadcast it on television to people in China, basically saying, this is what they have. We should be striving for this. And they've sort of been living along the trajectory of that ambition ever since. But is that even a problem? I'll hand it back over to you. And if you want to, by the way, you can call in to join this conversation, 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Jamarl, what do you think?
It's not really a problem in the overt sense. It's a problem for us. Because for us, it's competition. And, we take a look at this stuff pretty seriously, right? Because ultimately, I'll just say it from my standpoint, I think it's impossible to have world peace if you have a capitalistic system where all of these guys are at each other's throats for resources. I think it drives up the hysteria in general. This guy wants it. What is he willing to do to get it? Well, if you pay him a certain amount, he's going to do some horrible, horrible things to get it. And he will be perfectly okay and sleep well at night doing so because he is being paid to do it. I think I think a lot of that has to do with competition as opposed to this kind of cooperative engagement. Jack Fresco or Peter Joseph, he talks a lot about this kind of cooperative development as opposed to this notion of competitive, and making the point that human beings kind of are like, water in a vase or water in a vase, that it takes the shape depending upon the environment that the individual is in. If a person lived on Vulcan, they act like a Vulcan despite them being human. The same thing kind of applies with this. We have a competition for resources, and it's very possible that the only way that competition for resources could ever be satisfied is if there's some level of cooperation around the globe that this world becomes world heritage. The problem with that is obvious. The 6 people that own half of the world would never be okay with that. But I would wager that a lot of the fault is there. I could be wrong, but I do think countries fight for their own interests and those type of things, so I don't begrudge a country from doing that. But peace is something different. Peace doesn't necessarily require everybody to be kumbaya or one world government. That just requires people to understand each other's limits and their lines. And look, we were talking about this earlier today, the hypocrisy of this stuff. We don't tend to pay attention to those lines. And, we'll send our forces all across the world while simultaneously having trouble ensuring that the vaccines get distributed. So yeah, I don't look at it as a problem in the sense of overt or as an absolute. I look at it as it is a friction that will be created as China expands, because they have every right to expand, just like any other country has every right to expand. And the only issue with that, more than anything else, is whether or not we allow it or whether or not we step aside if we can't compete. Now, if we don't step aside, that's conflict. And there's going to be severe conflict.
We're not going to step aside.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not going to step aside. That is not going to happen. Even under Trump, who is, the most isolationist, quote unquote, candidate that we had seen in a long time, he wasn't stepping aside. He was trying to go toe to toe with China with the trade war and trying to take them down a notch. But again, what the hell were we even thinking? Did we not? I guess I'll put it like this: did we not see this coming? This policy has been pivoting to China in some way, economically, and trying to, split them up from the Soviet Union and bring them around to our side back in the early 70s. This has been 50 years in the making. We've been doing this for a very long time. This wasn't hard to foresee. This was extremely easy to foresee. And so of course that's left us in a weird position, as many have noted, where if you look at the Democrats, Russia is a much less significant, quote unquote, threat than China. And arguably neither of them are threats in any, useful, meaningful sort of direct sense of the word. They're competitors in a long run sense. But the Democratic Party has for a long time focused on Russia to the exclusion of pretty much anybody else. Russia and a couple of their, I wouldn't even call them friends necessarily, but a couple of countries that they've worked with, including Iran and including Syria. The Democratic Party has for a long time focused on Russia to the exclusion of China, because it's not just that Democrats are more friendly with the Chinese or whatever. It's that for a long time, our country it's been in bed with China in a very deep way, because it's been in both parties' interests to do so. So we set this up for ourselves. And, it's not even necessarily a problem. You talk about peace. There have been periods of relative peace and prosperity. I would argue that the 19th century was relatively peaceful compared to either the century that preceded it or the century that followed it. There were a bunch of small revolutions, and yes, there were wars, but there weren't anything like the religious wars you'd seen in the previous couple of centuries, and there wasn't anything like you saw, very soon after with the First and Second World Wars. And I don't know it all. I'm not going to try to get knee deep into exactly how that happened, but it seemed like there was a widely split balance of powers around the world, where you had the United Kingdom, you had the Netherlands, you had France, you had the United States, which was growing, you had Russia, you had the Ottoman Empire, you had all of these different sort of regional zones of power. And it seems that as we moved into a sort of more unilateral mode of being, first through this crisis point in the world wars, and then in the second half of the 20th century into the United States predominance, what you got was a lot of bloody constant warfare. And so maybe, again, this is something we used to talk about all the time earlier on in the show. Maybe it'd be good for us to get back to multipolarity. Maybe it'd be good for us to get back to that.
I mean, because the moment that you get one country that's a superpower, you have difficulties with the other countries. It's like the policeman of the world stuff. I mean, even the European Union, I thought it was the weirdest thing ever when Donald Trump first pulled out the JCPOA. And initially, Europe was belly aching about it. They were, angry, upset. But if you remember, they were supposed to be able to basically protect Iranian businesses. I mean, that was the deal, right? That if one party pulls out, the other parties will put pressure, and we'll make sure that the sanctions are lifted and those type of things. When Donald Trump took office and passed sanctions, the companies that were in Europe, many of those, especially the bigger ones, stopped doing business with Iran. Europe couldn't protect it. So it's like, regardless of, the European Union coming together as this huge dominant economic power, it still was insufficient to stop those sanctions from going through with the various companies because of the powerhouse that the United States is. I think what the United States realizes, and what we recognize, at least now, is the same, during the Second World War, we put military on both sides of the globe while also giving weapons and materials and everything else to the various countries that were part of the war. That's an astonishing amount of industrial power. And so if you're gutting your own industry, and you're turning around for somewhere like China, where they're expanding their industry, It doesn't necessarily take this kind of leap of logic to see where that goes, this kind of inflection point where that 1.5 billion people gets accentuated in a way, whereas we are plodding along in our own path. So no, I do think it's a big deal. I do think this notion of multipolar world, I don't know if that works. I mean, because otherwise we did land in the First or Second World Wars. One of those things where those things did happen. So even that, it doesn't seem like a way out. So, I guess, looking at it, Shane, I guess we're in a situation where, like you said, we're awash in perspectives. So I would say we're awash in perspectives. And we don't get...
Well, I was just going to say, to a certain extent, it's not subject to our own ambitions or our own preferences. There's this idea that history just sort of works itself out. It's hard to interpret exactly what happened in the past and what led to what. And then it's even harder, I would say, to try to actually create some useful new future. And there are bad ways of configuring your society, and then there are worse ways of configuring your society. I don't know one yet found a good way of setting a society up, but maybe that's too pessimistic for some. I don't know. We need to go into a break. We'll be back in another minute with headlines, talking politics, talking China, talking the rise of some and arguably the decline of others. But again, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back on the other side of this break with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for our last hour, the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, events, and more across our states, as well as across the surface of our increasingly fragmented globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, getting back into the headlines, specifically in COVID news, at least 1,299 new coronavirus deaths and 87,727 new cases were reported in the U.S. yesterday, February 7th. Over the past week, there has been an average of 117,993 cases per day. I think we could just round that up to 118,000 about. That's a decrease of 31% from the average 2 weeks earlier, and that has continued to decrease for the last 2 weeks. We've seen decreases of about 30% per week. So again, let's just hope that continues. As of Monday morning, more than 27 million people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 463,000 people have died from it. South Africa has temporarily canceled its rollout of the AstraZeneca vaccine. This is due to a study released on Sunday, which showed the vaccine provided only minimal protection against a local variant of the coronavirus circulating in the country. A spokesperson for AstraZeneca said the company was working closely with the South African Ministry of Health and said it still believes the vaccine will provide protection against the worst effects of the new B.1.351 variant. China's National Health Commission announced today that for the first time in about 2 months, its mainland recorded no new locally transmitted COVID-19 cases. The country recorded a total of 14 new cases on Sunday, but those were determined to be infections brought back from overseas. The report also said that Beijing does not count asymptomatic cases. And that itself is significant. That would, lower their total count. But still, no new community circulation in, on a single day period. in 2 months. That's pretty damn significant for a country with such a massive population, and of course the country that is widely thought to be the source of the virus. More than 1,500 more elderly residents of New York State adult care facilities died from COVID-19 than health officials previously reported, a new report reveals. The number accounting for an 8-fold leap over the 219 deaths reported earlier from the facilities comes after state officials adjusted the figures to reflect adult care patients who died in hospitals rather than the centers themselves. The revelation also comes one day after state health officials also quietly updated their statistics for nursing home deaths from the pandemic to reflect an additional 4,067 patients who died in hospitals. This comes after the release of a report by New York's Attorney General on this exact topic. It's just that they've actually started to officially update the figures quietly. In national political news, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot and the CEO of Chicago Public Schools have announced a tentative agreement with the Chicago Teachers Union. Under that plan, which has not yet been formally approved by the union, pre-K students would head back to school on Thursday, February 11th. That's this Thursday. Kindergarten through 5th grade teachers and students would return March 1st, and 5th through 8th grade teachers and students would be back March 8th. It is currently unclear when the union will vote on the issue, whether they want to approve or decline that plan. And again, we had a conversation about this with Bill Ayers, a native of one of Chicago's suburbs, on Friday. Go back and check that out. Interesting interview. It was 8:45 a.m. Eastern. Houston, Texas leaders unveiled a 2-block mural Saturday dedicated to George Floyd and located directly in front of his alma mater, Jack Yates High School. And back up to the national level, the Biden administration will move today to rejoin the United Nations Human Rights Council, nearly 3 years after President Donald J. Trump withdrew the United States from it. In international news, in an interview on CBS yesterday, President Biden says the U.S. does not need to engage China as a direct adversary. He complimented Xi Jinping on some personal qualities while criticizing him on his politics. We have a clip from that interview. Andre, let's play this clip.
He's very bright. He's very tough. He doesn't have, and I don't mean as a criticism, just a reality, he doesn't have a democratic small d bone in his body. But he is, the question is, I've said to him all along that we need not have a conflict, but there's going to be an extreme competition.
Extreme competition. We were talking about this in our last segment, talking about the long-term rise of China, what that portends, and whose fault it is, if you can really fault anybody for it. Again, I'll just put it like this. I see this as him trying to distinguish himself from Trump. Trump clearly started the trade war on China, against China, and Biden is not going to continue that. Trump ended it in part towards the end of his term, but Biden is not planning. He's planning on taking another tack. Now, what tack that will be exactly still remains somewhat unknown. It's not like we're planning for a war, and it doesn't seem like we're planning for a trade war. It seems like we'll just be running in our own tracks, effectively competing with each other. But we'll see for how long that lasts. Jamarl, any quick commentary?
Not really. I mean, we spoke about it last time. I do think, not really. I get sick of the competition. That's all. Like it just feels like we do have the ability to make this cooperative world. And yes, that sounds Pollyannish. Yes, that sounds, some people may even say naive. But I don't necessarily think that's true. I don't think it's naive at all. I think it's possible. I just think it's difficult to do it in our current state, meaning it has to fall before it becomes something else. So, yeah, unfortunately, we just kind of, like you said, paying attention to it doesn't necessarily mean we have power over it. But it's unfortunate. That's all.
Well, an interesting thing, just as a brief aside, an interesting thing about competition is that it actually breeds similarity. You'd think, okay, competitors are opposed to each other, they're going to be different. But if you're competing with somebody, you tend to look at what they're doing and try to improve on it, which means you tend to adopt their tactics. And I'm just going to note, we have a global civilization at this point, as far as I can tell. To a rounding error, we're all living in the same thing. We wear the same kinds of clothing for the most part. We wear the same suits. We don't speak the same languages, certainly, but we're all in constant contact. Our economic and political systems have, if you look at the frame of reference historically, we have so much more in common than we used to. And we have, I've just put it like that. And economically, we're all tied into functionally the same economic system. So by any sort of broad, reasonable definition of civilization, we're all in this thing together. And of course, with the climate, that's even more significant. Anyway, I just wanted to note that. Getting back to the headlines, President Joe Biden's administration is moving to revoke the designation of Yemen's Houthis as a terrorist group, citing the need to mitigate one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters. And the center-left candidate in Sunday's elections in Ecuador, Andres Arauz, has a lead over his conservative opponent, Guillermo Lasso, but that election will be going to a runoff. And by the way, we'll be revisiting both of these topics with our next two guests. We're going to be talking to Randy Norton in just a few minutes about Yemen, the Houthis, and what's been going on there, what Biden's recent speech last week signals for both the United States, Yemen, and the United States relationship with Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then in our second segment, we're going to be talking with Danny Shaw about Ecuador and Juan Guaido over in Venezuela, but we'll be coming back to that in a few minutes. The EU's foreign envoy, Josep Borrell, has said that Europe and Russia are drifting apart. This is after he returned from a visit to the country in which he spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin and the country's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, who called the EU an unreliable partner. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has pled not guilty to corruption charges in court for the first time as his trial resumes in Jerusalem. He is the first serving Israeli Prime Minister to go on trial, which takes place just a month before elections. Mr. Netanyahu, 71 years old, is accused of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in 3 separate cases. Hundreds of protesters gathered outside the district courthouse ahead of the Prime Minister's brief appearance this morning, making noise, waving banners, and calling for him to resign. The Netherlands has called a halt to all new adoptions from abroad in reaction to a highly critical report which condemned the role of government officials and highlighted a wide range of abuses, including corruption, forgery, and child snatching. Egyptian authorities on Saturday freed an Al Jazeera journalist after more than 4 years in detention, his family lawyer said. Mahmoud Hussein walked free from a police station Saturday afternoon. This is a few days after a court ordered his conditional release pending investigations into charges of publishing false information and belonging to a banned group. In Greece, regions have lost electricity after a fire broke out at a power station in Athens. The cause of that fire is unknown. And in India, a massive search and rescue operation is underway after a part of a mountain glacier broke off, flooding a nearby hydroelectric plant and damaging construction of another dam that was being built nearby. At least 18 are dead and around 200 are missing. In business news, on Friday, the National Labor Relations Board rejected Amazon's attempt to delay a union vote set to begin today as Amazon warehouse workers move to unionize. For many, the online giant's bid was seen as a stalling tactic, including a motion to demand votes take place in person, a clear health risk as the COVID-19 virus still poses a major threat in the United States and globally. Frank Shankwitz, a co-founder of the Make-A-Wish charity and a former Arizona state trooper, has died. The Make-A-Wish organization confirmed Shankwitz's death. He died at his home in Prescott of esophageal cancer on January 21st. He was 77 years old. That organization was created in 1980 after Shankwitz and 5 others helped a 7-year-old Phoenix boy battling leukemia be a highway patrol officer for a day. Shankwitz also initially served as president and CEO. And in sports news last night, the Buccaneers won their first Super Bowl since 2002, and they became the first team to play and win a Super Bowl in their home stadium. The quarterback, 43-year-old Tom Brady, won his 7th Super Bowl, but first with a team other than the New England Patriots. He was also the oldest player to ever play in a Super Bowl. President Biden called into Super Bowl watch parties in Kabul and on the aircraft carrier the USS Nimitz to thank service members during the game. And the social media website Reddit took out a 5-second Super Bowl commercial that included a shout-out to underdogs, an apparent nod to the recent Redditor-fueled GameStop investment frenzy. And by the way, just on that, GameStop's stocks have continued to decline. I'm just going to point that out. I haven't been following AMC or the other companies nearly as closely because, of course, GameStop was at the head of that pack and have certainly taken up most of the attention. But stocks have continued to fall. So that's part of the fallout from that. But it will serve for a long time as a sort of public event, a historical event that emboldened people, I would say, to stand up to hedge funds. That's certainly the popular narrative on it. I don't know, man. We're more than a week out at this point. We're about a week and a half out from the heyday of GameStop. Any sort of thoughts on this?
No, not really.
At this
I
point,
did point out
Jamarl,
that the stock was going to fall.
Change in take?
The mechanics of it hadn't changed or anything like that. So yeah, it was going to fall. It's weird. It's just such a weird case. This kind of like bubble philosophy or stuff that gets created in the market at times. Look, I don't like the fact that some people are going to lose money out of that, and especially if those are just regular people who are jumping into the stock. However, it is very bizarre for them to try to add rulings now on something like this when the other stock manipulations were taking place. Like, I don't know how they have one without the other. And it seems like, the people got all up in arms about this very specific one for GameStop, the political leaders, the people in Wall Street and everything else. And now they wanted to jump and get something done. People should pay attention to the way that they would respond when it's the unwashed masses doing this, as opposed to, the big guys. And by the way, it wasn't just hedge funds. I mean, it wasn't just the little guys. It was also hedge funds getting in on this in order to make profit because they didn't believe the stock was going to fall at a certain amount of time. So yeah, there's a lot with the GameStop thing. And like you said, that's going to be this kind of cult classic for the foreseeable future going forward. It's like Black Friday or something.
And we'll see how this affects Robinhood's IPO later this year, which is, of course, one of the main apps. It was the largest app trading GameStop. Yeah. After they shut down trades on the stock, they faced a massive public backlash. And I'm not sure that's going to go over well when they go public. But we'll see. Anyway, with that, we're going to close this segment out. Those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we'll be back in a minute on the other side of this break talking with our next guest, Randy Nord, about the Houthis, Yemen, Biden's moves, and what we're seeing. If we're planning on a hot war or if we're planning on pulling out, we'll see. We'll be right back on the other side of this break.
No, Randy.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars. Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate. No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary. I see what you did there. Yep. Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320. And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
No, Randy.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're coming to you live from across the country, but you can check us out on the radio in Washington, D.C. We're on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also on in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. And if you're digging what Jamarl and I are putting down, please do check us out on our various social media platforms. We're currently on YouTube and Twitter as our main lines of social media contact. YouTube, you can search for either Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas. Either of those searches will take you to channels with active subscriber bases and active chat rooms. Please do like, share, and subscribe to those channels. On Twitter, twitter.com/faultlinesradio. Give us a follow there. If we get cut off from those platforms, well, we're currently working on contingency plans for this stuff, getting set up on other video platforms that we will be debuting soon. But you can also check us out on our audio options. Those include the Sputnik app, Spreaker app, Spotify, Apple Music, and iHeartRadio. And as always, you can call us in pretty much any segment other than headlines. The number is 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. We're currently in the process of trying to bring our next guest, Randy Nord, on, co-founder of Geopolitics Alert. We're going to be talking about Biden reversing the Houthi rebel designation that just came out. And this comes after last week in his first big speech since Inauguration Day on foreign policy. He said that we were planning on pulling out of Yemen, although we were still planning on defending the Saudis, still planning on providing Saudi Arabia defensive support. The point that we were making at the time was, how can you really split the line between the two? How can you keep us from giving Saudis arms, which is, I'm guessing, what we would be doing, while also prohibiting them from using those armaments in Yemen? I'll put it like this, Jamarl. While we're trying to bring our guest on, I want to hear your take. what do you think is their strategic calculus for Biden here? Why is he trying to, you can make the humanitarian disaster. You can make the case that this is a humanitarian crisis, but frankly, it has been one for years. Now, admittedly, that was under Trump's regime, but I can't help but think that Biden, who's Secretary of State Blinken, is pretty hawkish on Iran. I can't help but think that they would want to continue whatever engagements we have in the region to screw with the Iranian administration, basically, and to, keep that ball rolling. Why do you think he's doing this?
That's a good question. I guess there's a cynical answer and there's maybe a geopolitical answer. From a cynical answer, well, this could be pushing back against the Saudis. I mean, it could be one of those things where Joe Biden may be bothered, actually, by the humanitarian consequences of Yemen, especially with all of the press, and not great press on Yemen. I mean, the bombs that were hitting some of those, the indiscriminate killings of the kids and everything else. Like, so if you're Joe Biden and you get into the administration, is this a sore spot that was started the last time you were vice president? Do you want to try to fix your errors? And mind you, it's not his error, but I'm just making the point of us engaging, us greenlighting that war in Yemen was a massacre. And you're talking about weaponizing famine, weaponizing disease, all of those things. We were basically backing Saudi Arabia the entire way through as they were doing it. So, look, I don't know if he's having a crisis of conscience, if such a thing is. But look, I am glad that he's doing it. But like you say, I don't necessarily know how they disambiguate those things. This is what I'll just read there, the State Department. We have formally notified Congress of the Secretary's intent to revoke these designations. Now, the designations, this is the terrorist stuff, the Houthi stuff. They did this, Trump did this just before he left office. And it basically would make it that much more difficult for them to get supplies and everything else. So right here, we have formally notified Congress of the Secretary's intent to revoke these designations, a State Department official said in a statement. Quote, the decision has nothing to do with our view of the Houthis and their reprehensible conduct, including attacks against civilians and kidnapping of American citizens. We're committed to helping Saudi Arabia defend its territory against further such attacks, the official said. Our actions is entirely due to humanitarian consequences of this last-minute designation from the prior administration. So I don't know what they would get out of this, outside of the humanitarian thing. Because I gotta be honest, it looks horrible. And, maybe it's one of those things where he's trying to create a demarcation point between him and Trump. Like, I'm not sure. Honestly, the JCPOA could even be a part of this, where these guys want to somehow get back to it, even though they want to save face by not giving up anything in their pursuit of it. I don't know what's going on in Joe Biden's head on this. So, but I would say this. I do like the fact that we're pulling out of that war, if indeed we do pull out of that war. But that's one of those things you have to pay attention to, because who knows? The boots on the ground thing can often come back to haunt us. But what do you think? I mean, is there like a what do you think do you think there's a reason beyond humanitarian causes for something like this? Oh, good. Danny Shaw.
Yes. Yeah. Of course. Yeah. I just don't know what it is. Yeah. That's why I'm asking. No, I'm genuinely befuddled about this. We have our next guest on, though. I think we should go to him. We are joined now by Danny Shaw, Professor Danny Shaw. He is an international affairs analyst and professor of Latin American studies. You can follow Danny on Twitter, by the way, at Danny Wacuni. That is Danny with two N's, WHAWCUNY. Danny, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with us. All right, we've got a lot to talk about between yesterday's elections in Ecuador, which I'll start with, and what's going on in Venezuela with charges filed against Juan Guaido, which we'll come back to. First, let's focus on Ecuador. Right now, the election is going into a runoff. This is after the left-leaning candidate took the majority of the votes, beating out the conservative candidate and leaving in distant third place another sort of progressive eco-socialist candidate who we can come back to if we have time. But first of all, Professor Shaw, what are your thoughts on yesterday's elections?
Definitely the pink tide is back in the driver's seat. This is the return of the pink tide, the Bolivarian momentum, the momentum of South American integration, of progressive left-wing anti-imperialist forces. This is a big victory. Andrés Arauz got over 31% of the vote. So definitely Correísmo, as the left-wing momentum is called in Ecuador, because Rafael Correa was the initial inspiration or leader, president for 10 years, who ushered in all types of progressive change. El Correísmo is celebratory today, but at the same time, there's going to be a runoff because they didn't get the 50% that they needed so that there wouldn't be a runoff. And this runoff is particularly dangerous because you could have Lasso, the neoliberal banker supported by the U.S., unite with Perez, I would say progressive in quotation marks there. And I think that's something we need to peel back the layers of. So this is a victory in the short term, but in 45 days, the two top candidates, we still don't know if it's Lasso or Perez, but a lot can happen in the next 45 days.
Welcome to the show first. Thank you for joining us, Professor Shaw. So I paid attention to Ecuadorian politics for a while, especially under Correa. A lot of this drew attention after the Julian Assange. He basically gave Julian Assange, the word is jumping out of my head. But basically, he allowed Julian Assange to be safe for a period of time. His reasoning was asylum. Thank you. His reasoning was fascinating to me because he basically made the point, we're a nation just like any other nation. And we have just as much right to give amnesty to a person as any other nation. I love that. Now, when Moreno gets in, people thought that Moreno was going to be something similar to Correa, and he wasn't. He was somewhat of a dramatic departure from those things, especially from the standpoint of sovereignty of Ecuador, meaning all sorts of pressure was brought against Moreno that Correa, for whatever particular reason, seemed to handle far better. How did this interaction between these two affect this current election? Meaning the public's point of view of the things that were taking place over the last several years, and especially going into the election yesterday.
Yes. Shane and Jamarl, it's so important to go back a few years because we all thought, I was in Caracas at the time, and we were celebrating. We thought Lenín Moreno was the continuation of the pink tide, of the Bolivarian movement. And then very quickly, Lenín Moreno does this about face and becomes one of the greatest traitors to the cause in the history of South America. And the Ecuadorian delegation immediately alerted us in Caracas in 2017. So Alianza País became divided between the pro-Moreno sellout factions and the Correísta factions. So there's all of that recent history. We saw how horribly this neoliberal Lenín Moreno, and he's not worthy of his own name. We saw how they mishandled the pandemic. We saw the bodies strewn through the streets of Guayaquil. We've seen all these big IMF accords selling off the future of Ecuador. That was one of Trump's 11th hour moves, as if they hadn't already signed enough billion-dollar deals with the IMF and U.S. banks. They signed another one right before Trump left office. And Moreno, very symbolically, has spent the last week in Washington, D.C. As Ecuador goes to the polls, the 17 million people of Ecuador, and then a million plus here in the diaspora, specifically here in New York City, in Queens and New Jersey. How symbolic that where was Lenín Moreno there in D.C. with his backers. So all of this is now playing out. Moreno's approval rate at this point is in the single digits, 5 or 6%. I think we have to really look at La CONAI, the indigenous consejo, and where the indigenous are at, because it's still not clear. Lasso, there's critiques from the left and from the right that not every vote has been counted, of voter fraud, of irregularities. So all of that has to be sorted out. The media in Ecuador is an anti-Correísta media. It's an anti-pink tide media. It's in private hands. They've done everything in the run-up to this election to vilify Venezuela, to vilify Bolivia, to say that Ecuador is going to be the next Venezuela. Whatever that means, without, of course, contextualizing the horrific blockade against Venezuela. So I think we should spend some time, too, understanding how the right wing has used Carlos Perez, and he changed his name to an indigenous name 4 years ago. So there's a lot of debate about whether he truly represents the indigenous movement.
So you're talking, again, let's come back to this. Currently going by Yaku Perez, Carlos Perez is his original name. I saw you retweeting this Gray Zone article from Saturday. I was reading through that myself about this candidate. Can you go into him briefly? We've got a couple of minutes left on this side of the segment. Who is Perez? What does he stand for? And also, please, of course, talk about his involvement, his support for overthrow operations, U.S.-backed coups in Bolivia, Brazil, Venezuela, Nicaragua. Please, Professor Shaw, take it away.
Yeah, everyone should see that Ben Norton article, which is impeccably researched on the history of Carlos Perez. This is identity politics on steroids in Ecuador. The terms they use in Ecuador are folklorista, somebody who appropriates an indigenous discourse. Like I said, he changed his name 4 years ago. He's always been anti-Venezuela. La CONAI, I don't want to dismiss the entire Consejo because there's a right wing and a left wing in the indigenous CONAI, but they never denounced the coup in Bolivia. So Carlos Perez, there's this interesting Quechua concept that I learned from the time I spent in Ecuador, Guayapamushka. And Guayapamushka means hijo del viento, a son of the wind, someone who goes with the wind, who goes with opportunism. So that's how the left sees Carlos Perez, as somebody who has divided the vote, as somebody who has his eyes on power. So really, in a sense, though there is a celebratory mood today, it's a cautious celebration because the La Unión por la Esperanza, the UNES, okay, they won 31% of the vote, but now the real hard work begins, specifically among the indigenous. If we look at the electoral map, Carlos Perez got a lot of that indigenous vote. And people don't have a sense of the big geopolitical context. So when the right wing says we're going to become the next Venezuela, a lot of people fall for that because all they've ever heard, just like here in the U.S., is negativity about Venezuela. We know that it's a media blockade as much as an economic and military blockade. So we're talking about a people like the American people, where there's a battle for historical memory and recent historical memory. So what Carlos Perez has done is dressed himself up in this indigenous discourse. He's received all types of money from NGOs, and when the all the paperwork comes out in the proof, I'm sure U.S. intelligence is all over this. So again, La CONAI is very divided on this, and that's what's going to determine the vote. Right now, in the short term, it's still not clear if the banker Lasso or this quote-unquote progressive right-wing identity politician won, because they're right now tied. So it's not even clear who's going to have the runoff with Andres Arauz. But what Perez and Lasso are going to try to do is form this right wing, even if they try to dress it up as progressive, and that's the danger of it. They're going to form a coalition against Arauz. They're going to be professional haters because they know Arauz and Correísmo has all the momentum.
All right, we've got to close this segment up, but thank you for the breakdown. We're joined by Professor Danny Shaw, an international affairs analyst and professor of Latin American studies. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, and we'll be back with Danny Shaw on the other side of this break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in D.C. Joining us is Professor Danny Shaw, an international affairs analyst and professor of Latin American studies at CUNY. And again, Professor Shaw, thank you for joining us. Absolutely.
Thank you for having me.
So one of the other interesting cases that occurred over the weekend, or I should say at the end of last week, has to do with a report from Jose Brito. He's the president of the Special Commission to investigate measures taken against the Republic. Now, this is against Juan Guaido. And for the longest time, we've been wondering how on earth can Juan Guaido get away with such treason without there being consequences? Well, apparently we're not the only ones having that idea. So this is the statement, quote, "Two prosecutors were hired to investigate the damages, and we are collecting all the information. We have allegedly received criminal acts holding Juan Guaido responsible for various charges, not just corruption because he is no longer a civil servant. In addition to conspiracy, usurpation of function, assassination, organized crime, unification to commit a crime, and treason, among other things. He assumes, or he is sure, that the sum of all his crimes reached a sentence of more than 200 years in prison." Now, considering Juan Guaido was calling for a violent uprising, and not just the violent uprising, the contract that he basically signed that they were going to be perfectly okay with going in, killing as many people as possible in order to capture or kill Maduro. Like, this stuff is extreme. And so the fact that this is finally being investigated, what are your thoughts on this? And if you want, you can expand upon, anything that just said there, but what is your just initial impression of this?
Yeah. This is an ongoing question and an ongoing debate. I've always asked the Venezuelan leadership when we could have different sit-downs and conversations. Many of us on the left have asked this very question: how come you let Guaido, this sellout, this dangerous individual, why did you let him basically, quote unquote, do his thing freely? Why wasn't he locked up? If not worse, may I dare say, not suggest, but say. And that was the critique coming from the Venezuelan Communist Party. But the PSUV understood that it was a type of trap. They didn't want to take the bait that if they touched one hair on Juan Guaido's head, then the U.S. would have the military justification to invade. We know this is the darling of the U.S. But the Juan Guaido support camp is in complete crisis. Last week, we saw Costa Rica, Panama, other Latin American countries have withdrew their support, and the fake ambassadors. We've seen the European Union say they don't recognize Juan Guaido. As of January 5th, Juan Guaido is not even in the National Assembly. So maybe now the leadership sees that he truly is weakened and isolated and can pay for his crimes of treason, crimes for supporting this $15 million bounty that's on the head of not just Nicolas Maduro, but other tried and true Bolivarian leaders. But Joe Biden, we saw Carlos Vecchio at Biden's inauguration. That was the emissary of Guaido here in D.C. And the U.S. government is insisting upon this exhausted option, this Monroeist, as if it was 1824 again, option of supporting Juan Guaido. So imperialism is in crisis. And to connect it to the last story, that's why it's so important to have a victory, the victory we've seen in Bolivia recently. There's elections in Salvador. We see in Ecuador the pink tide flowing back. There's elections in Honduras later this year where El Partido Libre, there's Zelaya, has a good chance of winning, is in the lead. So as this momentum swings back to the left, it opens up ground for Venezuela and the Bolivarian cause to breathe.
I want to come back to Juan Guaido in just a second because there's more to talk about. And you're right, the EU has started to push away with the EU leadership saying they no longer recognize him. Biden still does. And they've said they're not open to conversations with Maduro, who the United States government has, again, seen as the illegitimate leader of that country, of Venezuela, for the last 2 years. But I want to come back to that because, first of all, I want to get into the idea of the pink tide for folks who haven't been following Latin America so closely. What is that concept? Where'd that come from? What's its relevance to this point? When did it start? What is it? Professor Shaw?
Yeah, the pink tide. 1998, I lived in the Dominican Republic, and I was with the anti-imperialist forces out there. And there we saw Hugo Chavez on TV before throngs, the masses of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. And that electoral victory in 1998 was the beginning of this revolutionary anti-imperialist momentum. So Venezuela definitely at the vanguard. And of course, that's why Venezuela has been so blockaded. And that's why there's this U.S. government starvation campaign against the 30 million people of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. After Venezuela, you have electoral victories of Evo Morales in Bolivia. You have Rafael Correa in 2006 in Ecuador. Now you have Lopez Obrador in Mexico. I mean, I wouldn't say he's part of the pink tide 100%, but he's at least neutralized Grupo de Puebla, Grupo de Lima, the Organization of American States, all of the imperialist lackeys who continue to do the bidding of the U.S., the fact that Mexico is now neutralized. And of course, Brazil, which is 1/3 of the continent, the largest economy, you have Lula, and you have Dilma Rousseff. So with all of that momentum, what does imperialism do? They sign on to this whole campaign that we can understand as lawfare. Lawfare is warfare through judicial and legislative means. They flip reality on its head in Brazil, in Ecuador, in Bolivia. And what they do is they accuse those forces that have most combated corruption. And that's not to say that any revolution is flawless. We're not saying that there aren't contradictions in any process, whether it's Venezuela, Bolivia, etc. But they engineer these soft coups, and they're able to put Lula in jail, and he can never run for president again. Rafael Correa is in Mexico right now. He's had to live in Belgium in exile. He's facing dozens and dozens of political charges. And one could make an argument that no one has done more for the working people and the indigenous in the history of Ecuador. Why is he in exile? Why is Jorge Glass, the vice president of the Pink Tide movement of Correísmo in Ecuador? Jorge Glass has COVID right now and has been in prison for 2 years. So that's the essence of the Pink Tide, and many are calling this Pink Tide 2.0, with the return of the MAS in Bolivia and with the electoral victory last night in Ecuador.
That's really interesting. I'm curious, do the countries that are part of the Pink Tide, do they think to themselves or think of their future together in a certain way? I'm saying that in somewhat of a weird way. What I mean is, knowing that this does seem to be this kind of Monroe Doctrine that takes place, where the resources of South America get basically used, sanctions get put on the countries they don't particularly like. Because that policy is there, and because they know that various coups are taking place in many of those countries, do they function as in this kind of organized body of sorts as they operate? I know not now, because many of these right-wing governments have taken power. But when they were functioning as a yellow tide, was there kind of a united front? Or was it just everybody doing their own thing in their own sandbox, even though it was to the left? Does it make sense? I'm trying to understand, like, it's called a pink tide, but is it specific to individual states? Or was it this kind of grand thing where all of them were in some kind of coordination or conversation with each other?
Yeah, 100% Shane, 100% Jamarl. These are great questions. And many over there in Caracas and in Quito and in Havana, because of course Cuba's been at the true vanguard of this since 1959. You know, they would say, why go pink 1,000 times when you can go red once? But we can leave that for a later conversation. There's different political tendencies within this pink tide. Some are more moderate, some are more revolutionary, right? There's always, in every mass movement, there's a right wing and a center and a left wing. It's not called pink tide in Latin America. It's called the Bolivarian unity, the Bolivarian momentum. And to speak to your question, 100%. What it meant was one of the most significant things. I was teaching in Nicaragua at the time in 2005, and they built Telesur. And Telesur was really, if you will, the revolutionary CNN, because we know where CNN stands on all these issues, as if anybody listening to this had any illusions. So to have a revolutionary CNN, and the slogan was, "Our North is the South." We're always getting news before Telesur, before RT and Sputnik and everything. In 2005, 95% of all media was controlled from the European Union, Japan, and the US. Of course, that was how imperialists dominated historical memory and our grasp of reality. So here comes Venezuela in the vanguard. Telesur was a Venezuelan, Uruguayan, Argentinian, and Cuban joint operation. Later on, the Ecuadorians were involved. So yes, the Bolivarian project, the pink tide, means more integration. Like Andrés Arauz, who won last night in Ecuador, he's an integrationist. They look for more contacts, and not just in South America and the Caribbean. Of course, you have the whole project of Venezuela oil, and how they use that to build up social missions, not just in Venezuela, but in Nicaragua, in Haiti. And now we see the Haitian people who have also been at the vanguard, going way back before 1959 to 1804. And it's not just South American Caribbean integration, which of course, is for imperialism. This is the antithesis of imperialism. Imperialism wants to foster more and more dependency. But this is integration with the Middle East, in Africa, and in Asia, in Iran, in China, and in Russia. So that's what the pink tide has represented for the past 2 decades plus. More unity, more integration, and true self-determination in a political, economic, military, and diplomatic sense. Hence why the United States, whether it's through CNN, through Fox News, through the New York Times, why they've always been anti-pink
The voice that you guys were listening to or have been listening to is Professor Danny Shaw, an international affairs analyst and professor of Latin American studies at CUNY. You can follow Danny on Twitter at Danny Shaw Cooney. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking, we're taking your calls. 202-521-1320. We're now in the wrap segment, wrapping up today's show and preparing for the next one. Anything on your mind that you want to talk to us about, particularly stuff that we were talking about this morning. But hey, if there was something we didn't bring up that you think we should or you want to, please do call in. 202-521-1320. Again, that is 202-521-1320. We've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on. What's going on?
Good morning, gentlemen. I got 2 comments. Okay, my first comment is dealing with my EPA. Okay, I'm a VA whistleblower, everybody. I want to tell everybody about my case. And I sent off a FOIA request 2 years ago to the EPA requesting 3 emails, right? And they finally came. One is missing, the important one. That'll tell people that I was telling the truth, that I saw contaminated water. So basically, did not let me have the one that I need for my case. Basically, it says personal privacy information. The portions of records are exempt from disclosure because they contain personal information which would be unwarranted invasion of personal privacy if released. So basically, a pipe is in the ground that broke, where mud contaminants was seeking into it, going to the hospital, is being protected from, it's being protected because they have personal privacy rights now. So basically, that's what's going on. I can't believe this. I got to find a way to try to open up that case to get that record.
And just for folks who haven't followed, we had you on, I believe, in one of these segments a while back, and you were talking to us about your case. Basically, you were working in Houston at a Veterans Administration facility. I believe it was a hospital, right?
Yes, a hospital. Very important hospital. Yes.
Exactly. Thank you. So you were working at a VA hospital, and you were overseeing basically the water. You were doing work there, and you saw contaminants in the water, and you tried to get them to fix this, and it didn't get fixed. That's the extremely simple version. But specifically, there was mud in the water, and it was being used in the facility. Right, Tarif?
Well, yeah. Well, I brought it up when I worked there. I brought it up to him, but it's like nothing. It seemed like nothing was done because it kept constantly happening when I was doing utility work on the boilers, you know.
And you've been working on this for years. You know, this is for as long as you've called in, you've talked about this. You had a second point. I want to make sure you have time to get to that second point before I move on to other callers. What else were you talking about, Tarif?
Okay, the Patriot Act too. I feel to believe that you have a lot of the FBI infiltrate a lot of these right wing and left wing groups. All right, and I feel to believe through the COINTELPRO since the '60s, trying to get the Black Panthers and the Black Storm Rangers to fight each other in Chicago. That was a COINTELPRO operation. If something happened in this country, another huge event similar to September 11th is going to be blamed, of course, on the white nationalists or some other type of group, and they're going to try probably connect them to Iran to bring them into it, and that's going to try to be justified. It's going to justify them to push Patriot Act 2.0. You see what stops that type of stuff from happening? Well, whistleblower that's part of those operations or have a hint on those operations when they can leak out information. You know who? The organizations that can imprint that and not afraid, they'll call WikiLeaks. And one of their publishers is in prison right now. We need to get the man out. Free Julian Assange, hashtag drop the charges. That's how important it is right now. We got to get that man out because other news agencies and whistleblowers in there is afraid to speak up now. So we got to support him. So, yeah, so Free Julian Assange, a hashtag whistleblower Tyree Simon. That's me. We got to keep on driving forward. We can't give up.
Tarif.
Not give up.
Tarif,
move forward.
Thank you for the call. Fully in support of what you're saying about Julian Assange, and also worried about a Patriot Act 2.0 like you're talking about. We got another caller, and we're taking more. 202-521-1320 is the number. We got Karen calling in from Maryland. Karen, you're on. What's going on?
Hi there. Okay, let me take you off. Okay, hi there. Is that better? Nothing that we have to agree about, but I'm still not past what happened. I'm still not past the election, even if you all are past it. And there is a video that should prove that there were inaccurate election results in 7 states called Absolute Proof, if you're open to watching it, okay?
Okay. All right. Yeah, no, I'm broadly open to this stuff. I'm kind of honestly, like you said, I'm over it, but I'm always open at the same time. What are you talking about?
Are you asking me or telling me?
I'm asking you. What are you talking about?
Oh, okay. Well, okay. The video is called Absolute Proof. And even though the press has not covered this as it should, you all not included. The video should persuade those who are not convinced that there were inaccurate election results in 7 states. And I'm very sorry that Congress handled the situation the way that it did.
Okay, so you're talking about, all right, Karen, thank you for the call. Geez, my throat. You're talking about the Absolute Proof documentary coming from Mike Lindell, the CEO of MyPillow. I'll be honest, I'm inclined to distrust Mike Lindell from what I've seen of him.
Yeah, Mike Lindell is the one who was on that commercial that day when he was on Newsmax, I believe. And he still kept going into the election stuff. Like, oh, the demand machines of this and that, and Hugo Chavez and the CIA, because, the socialists can't build stuff like that. Yeah, Michael, that's him. That's Liddell. He is still pushing that boulder up a hill. So good on Liddell. I am eagerly awaiting his lawsuit. I'll put it that way. They are suing Giuliani for $1.3 billion. They're suing Sydney. She's another $1.3 billion. Newsmax had sense enough to realize that they were lined up for a lawsuit also, in which case they kept. That announcer got up in the middle of the conversation with Liddell because Liddell would not shut up about the voting thing. So I feel you. I am greatly dubious about anything that comes out that man's mouth. So that's where I am on that one. But hey, teach his own, right? Teach his own.
I hear you. All right, we got more callers. Let's go to Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on. What's going on?
Hey, what's going on, guys? I was actually calling to share with you guys a video that Jimmy Dore put up last week. It was actually a CNN clip where an ex-CIA member was actually talking about the First Amendment right and actually First Amendment rights and the actions they're taking to actually push media to deplatform and to deplatform a lot of independent voices in news, even to the point of making it where even went to the point of saying that our phone these phone companies like T-Mobile and such should not carry these alternative news resources, and he words it in a way whereas it makes it sound like they're offering this as just ideas. But I think we've seen and we know at this point that when they're saying these things and they're putting these things out in the media, they're just actually manufacturing consent, and these are measures they're already taking, and we know they're taking it because we've already seen a lot of people deplatform. I would say concerning the last caller, I would say that even though Giuliani and the lot took a idiotic position on the election fraud, we obviously know that doesn't mean that it's not true. We obviously know there's some very horrible things going on with our elections, and so I don't think it does us any good to just laugh at the fact that they make stupid arguments when there's information out showing that we do have problems with our elections. And I don't think it's overly cynical at this point to make that point, and from that point stress that people go and look deeper into our elections or any of this stuff. I mean, like even in your earlier segment where you were talking about Joe Biden and Yemen, yeah, they may not be supporting the Yemen war outright, but you're still supporting Saudi Arabia with weapons. So, and you're not curtailing how they use it. So then obviously you're still supporting the war in Saudi Arabia. You're just not saying that's PR. They're spinning everything, newspeak. So, I mean, at this point, I don't think cynicism is cynicism. I think cynicism is a very, very safe way of looking at things from our government. I'll leave it there.
Cynicism as a baseline, in my opinion, is absolutely healthy because it's justified. But again, that doesn't mean that I'm going to take on any specific claim. Now, I do agree with you that, and we talked about this on the show, there are significant problems in our elections. I think since this issue first came up, we have both made that point very consistently. But that doesn't mean that, and this isn't what you were saying, so I'm not really trying to argue with you on this one. It doesn't mean that we're going to buy into specific arguments that the election was overthrown in this way or that way. From when I was looking into it, I did not find proof. And I want to go and check out what people have, because if there's proof, I should know it, and I want to talk about it. But that's just telling you what I've seen so far.
What it means,
you got a couple more callers,
it would mean
Jamarl.
The greatest crime in the history of crimes, almost, at least from the standpoint of a government thing. Look, Trump's own attorneys were in there talking to Trump about this stuff, and they didn't even buy it. So, it's like, why would I take the position, if Trump can't defend his own position? Yeah, no. We might have trouble with our elections, fair enough, but that doesn't mean Donald Trump won in a landslide. And, the Mike Liddell, the pillow guy, is not the guy I'm going to trust on that one. Let's see, we have other callers. Who is...
Let's go to John, calling in from LA. John, you're on. What's going on?
Good morning, everybody. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but upon the subject of empire, let's just say this. Everybody wants to have the panty idea of, yeah, we can all work together, we can all be great, all work on this country. But let's be honest. We will not get to be a Type 1 or Carter 1 or anything like that without some sort of world council. And that would also mean a certain empire has got to disappear because they cause more struggle, strife, war, dead bodies than any other country on earth.
I think I know who you're talking about. No, I think I know who you're talking about, John. And I get what you're saying. I've got my problems with the idea of a world council if it were run in a certain way. But to be honest, that's what like you're saying, that's what you'd need if you wanted to have longer term peace, whatever that looks like. We got another caller. But what do you think, Jamarl?
I mean, look, how are resources going to be used across the planet? And is it possible to come to some kind of agreement without some kind of acknowledgement that it's world heritage? I don't think there is. But like you say, I'm also weirded out by that. But that could be relative station per se. But yeah, let's go to the next call.
Yeah, and in a certain sense, diplomacy works that way anyway. I don't know if that's how things operate. But again, that's the push for something like the United Nations, which again, the U.S. was ostensibly behind for a long time. Anyway, Keith from D.C. Keith, you're on. What's on your mind, man?
Oh, great show. Just wanted to sort of synthesize or integrate your first half with your second in regard to China. We know that China is a 3,000-year civilization. 18 out of the last 20 centuries, China was the largest economy. They're not trying to catch up. They're only getting back to where they were. Now, insofar as the second half, China has become Latin America's foremost lender and investor by far, and Russia has this footprint. They landed their two S-400 fighters there a couple of years ago. The recent coup in Venezuela was foiled. The Iranians got their oil shipment despite the so-called blockade. The U.S. empire is in slow, what we call, I want to put it this way, a controlled demolition. And I want you to integrate these two things and discuss this issue of the Monroe Doctrine is no longer, it's a fiction. And
I will think, Keith, we're out of time. I hear what you're saying. That's more to think about for future shows. Thank you for the call. Thank you, everybody, for listening today. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our producers. Thank you, Jamarl Thomas. Thank you, Engineer Andre. And thank you for listening. We'll be back tomorrow, folks. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan signing off.
And Stranahan, another one in the record books. All right, guys, this was a slightly weird show. Not horrid, but just weird. Some of the guests, we were trying to get certain people, and for whatever reason, we were having trouble getting them on. Also, I felt like I was dragging ass all day. But nevertheless, there's still some really good conversations. Sridharan, the India protests is phenomenal. Like, it's just massive. Also, the China thing and the Monroe Doctrine. No, I thought these were great conversations. Every so often, I would have people send messages saying, hey, could you talk about South America more? Hey, you never talk about South America. And so when we get the opportunity to get a really good guest like Professor Shaw, we want to take the opportunity to use it. And so Shaw was nice enough to basically stay for an extra 15 minutes to go into Venezuela and go into the Ecuadorian elections. And he clearly knows the stuff. I would probably say that was probably the best segment out of all of them. But no, it wasn't horrible, just odd. Yeah, just odd. All right, guys, I'm going to end this here because, like I said, I feel like I've been dragging ass all day. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I am going to say subscribe. You will most likely see me a little bit later today, depending on how things go. All right, guys.